Junior year of college is usually when things start to settle down. You finally know your way around campus and you are done with those tiny, cramped freshman dorms. Back when I was a junior, my friends and I managed to get a suite on campus. It was a pretty sweet setup. We had 4 individual bedrooms, and they all connected to a shared common room and a small kitchenette. It was basically our own little apartment, and we were sharing it with our closest friends. In the beginning, our friend Cody was living in the suite with us, but right before the semester really got going, Cody found an amazing deal on an off-campus apartment with another friend of his. He decided to take it, which we all understood, but it meant he had to move out of our suite. Because campus housing was so crowded, the university automatically assigned us a random replacement roommate. We were a bit nervous about who we would get, but we hoped for the best. Unfortunately, the kid they assigned to us was named Rodney. Rodney seemed normal enough at first. He was a very tall guy, standing at about 6 feet 4 inches, with a medium build. He had short blonde hair, a patchy light beard, and almost non-existent eyebrows. He was assigned to the bedroom in the far corner of the suite, which was right next to mine. For the first couple of days, Rodney kept entirely to himself. But then, one afternoon, I came back from my classes and found him sitting alone in the common room. He told me he had to tell me something. He sat me down and explained that he suffered from a condition called parasomnia. He told me this was actually the reason why he had been transferred from his previous dorm building. He explained that it was a sleeping disorder that could cause him to talk, yell, or even walk around in his sleep due to intense night terrors. He said he just wanted everyone in the suite to be aware of it, so that we would not feel uncomfortable. To be completely honest with you, having that as the very first real conversation with my new roommate made me feel more uncomfortable than anything else. I was hoping to get to know him on a personal level, not learning about his severe sleeping disorders. Once he went back to his room, I pulled out my phone and texted the dorm group chat we had made. Cody was still in the chat, even though he had moved out. I asked the guys if Rodney had told them about his sleeping disorder yet. They all replied saying no, followed by text messages filled with laughter and confusion. Later that evening, when my other 2 seatmates got back, we hung out in the common room and whispered among ourselves, trying to figure out what could have happened in Rodney's old dorm that made the university transfer him. Right as we were talking, Rodney walked in. He gave us a quick, silent nod, walked right past us, and shut himself in his room. We had the television turned up loud, and we whispered about him. That very same night, things started to get weird. I was lying in my bed, fast asleep, when I was suddenly awakened by a loud knock at my bedroom door. I sat up in the dark, rubbed my eyes, and asked who was there. No one replied. The suite was completely silent. I waited for a moment, thinking maybe I had imagined it, but I felt this uneasy sensation in my gut. I wondered if it had been Rodney. The next morning, I texted my other 2 suitmates and asked if either of them had knocked on my door in the middle of the night. Both of them texted back saying they had been fast asleep and definitely did not knock. Cody, who was reading the group texts, was having a great laugh about the whole thing, but I was genuinely freaked out. A few nights later, the situation got even worse. I woke up at exactly 2 o'clock in the morning. I heard the distinct sound of footsteps walking outside in the hallway of our common area. Then, right on cue, there was a firm knock at my bedroom door. I held my breath and remained completely silent. I did not answer this time. I knew it had to be Rodney, and his behavior was starting to seriously terrify me. He was clearly a heavy sleepwalker. I immediately texted the group chat right then and there, at 2 in the morning, telling them that the knocking was happening again. No one responded until the next morning. My suitmates said they had not heard a single thing during the night. I figured it was because Rodney's room was directly next to mine, so the sounds were much louder to me than to the others. Later that day, I decided I had to address it. I went over to Rodney's door, knocked, and when he opened it, I asked him directly if he had been knocking on my door. Rodney looked at me with a blank expression and said he had absolutely no recollection of doing that. But then he quickly apologized. He reminded me that sleepwalking was a major part of his parasomnia. He assured me that his sleepwalking was completely harmless. I tried to accept his apology, but I did not exactly view his behavior as harmless. It was waking me up in the dead of night and leaving me feeling incredibly unsafe. After that talk, About 4 days passed without any incidents, and I was starting to relax. But then, on the fourth night, I woke up to a strange noise inside my bedroom. I opened my eyes to the pitch-black room, trying to adjust my vision. As my eyes focused, I spotted a tall, dark silhouette standing in the corner of my room, facing the wall and muttering to himself. I managed to call out his name. The moment I spoke, Rodney slowly spun around in my direction. He kept repeating the same words over and over again in a flat voice. He kept saying, "Open the door, open the door." I was absolutely paralyzed with fear. He was looking directly in my direction, but his eyes were wide and completely vacant, looking right through me. Then a slow, creepy smile spread across his face, and he let out a quiet, chilling laugh. He turned, walked slowly out of my bedroom, and disappeared, but the silence did not last long. Suddenly, a deafeningly loud banging sound echoed from the common area. Rodney was screaming at the top of his lungs, "Open the door," over and over again like a maniacal madman. I leaped out of my bed and ran into the common room. I saw Rodney at the far end of the hallway, violently throwing his fists against one of my suitmate's bedroom doors. I ran up to him, grabbed his shoulders, and began shaking him as hard as I could, trying to wake him up. My other two suitmates threw their doors open to see what the commotion was, and we all started shaking Rodney's tall frame. Finally, Rodney stopped. He looked at the three of us with a completely blank, confused expression. He quietly said, "I am sorry, guys," and then he turned around, walked into his room, and shut the door behind him. The three of us stood there in shock, not even knowing what to say or do. A neighboring room must have called campus police because they showed up at our door. We had to tell them the truth. Rodney spoke with them for a while, then he went back to his room. I made sure not to leave my room unlocked again that night. The next day, Rodney was gone without a trace of him ever having been there. I know nothing about sleepwalking, but that did not look like sleepwalking to me. I do not know what was or currently is going on in that guy's head, but he needs to get help. Sometimes, the strangest threats in college do not come from the people we are assigned to live with, but from the gaps in our security. During my sophomore year, I shared a traditional dorm room with a girl named Stacy. Stacy and I got along really well. She could be a bit messy at times, leaving her clothes scattered around, but we never had any real arguments. We shared everything and constantly borrowed each other's things. Our dorm room had a set of bunk beds, which is a bit unusual for a college dorm. Because I was an incredibly light sleeper, we agreed that I would take the top bunk. Stacy had a habit of getting up in the middle of the night to use the restroom, so if she had been on the top bunk, her climbing down the ladder would have woken me up every single night. There is one specific night from that year that still haunts me, mostly because there is no logical explanation for what happened. Stacy and I were in our room studying. I was sitting at my desk, typing away on my laptop, and Stacy was lying on her bottom bunk, reading through her textbook. I had a massive presentation the next morning for one of my major classes, and I was incredibly nervous about it. I spent hours going over my talking points, practicing my delivery. Stacy was being incredibly supportive. She sat up and let me practice my presentation to her multiple times, acting as my audience and asking me questions afterward to help me prepare. She noticed I was stressing about what to wear, so she kindly offered to let me borrow one of her nice blouses the next morning, since I did not have many formal clothes with me at school. After helping me, Stacy went back to her own, studying for a little while longer before deciding to call it a night. She turned off her phone and went to sleep. Since I still had more work to do, I did not want to keep the main lights on and disturb her. As a courtesy, I turned off my desk lamp, climbed up to my top bunk, and continued reviewing my notes on my laptop with the screen brightness turned down low. Not long after, I heard Stacy start to snore softly from the bottom bunk, which was my cue that she was fast asleep. I kept working for about another hour, quietly whispering my presentation slides to myself before closing my laptop, placing it at the foot of my bed, and drifting off to sleep. I woke up around 5 o'clock in the morning, and the very first light of dawn was just barely beginning to peek through our window. As I lay there groggily, I heard the sound of footsteps moving around on the floor below me. I assumed Stacy was getting ready for an early morning run or heading to the bathroom. I peered over the edge of my bed and groggily whispered her name. A female voice from below immediately responded with a soft "mm-hmm." I asked her if I could still borrow that nice blouse for my presentation later that morning. The voice responded with another quiet, mm-hmm, and then I heard the squeak of Stacy's closet door swinging open. I whispered a quick thank you and watched as the figure, who I fully believed was Stacy, bent over inside the closet, searching through her clothes. After a moment, the figure stepped back out of the closet, turned toward my bunk, and gave me a silent, friendly wave before heading out the door. I heard the heavy dorm door click shut behind her. The sound of that door closing made me feel a bit more awake. I grabbed my phone from next to my pillow to check the time. It was exactly 5:15 in the morning. I started to wonder where Stacy could be going at this hour, but then a loud, distinct snore came from the bottom bunk directly beneath me. My heart stopped. I froze in my bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I had just imagined the sound. But then it happened again. A deep, rhythmic snore echoed from the lower mattress. I slowly leaned my head over the wooden railing of the top bunk and looked down. There, fast asleep under the heavy blankets, was Stacy. She had not moved an inch. Cold dread washed over me as I realized that the person I had just been talking to, the person who had been standing inside our closet just seconds ago, was not Stacy at all. My eyes darted over to the closet, and the door was still standing wide open. I scrambled down the ladder as fast as I could, rushed to our main door, and threw it open. I looked down the long hallway in both directions, but it was completely empty. I ran back into the room, grabbed Stacy, and shook her until she woke up. She was incredibly confused, but as soon as I told her that a stranger had just been inside our room, standing in her closet, she completely snapped to attention. She leaped out of bed and immediately began checking her closet and her desk to see if her wallet, laptop, or any valuables had been stolen. Surprisingly, absolutely nothing was missing. We called the campus police right away to report the intruder. The officers arrived and took our statements, promising to review the security camera footage from the main lobby of our building. However, a few days later, they informed us that the cameras did not show anyone unusual entering or leave the building around that time. To this day, I have no idea who that girl was, how she got into our locked room, or what she was doing in our closet. But I know for a fact that it was not a dream, and that thought still keeps me awake at night. The absolute worst feeling you can experience in college is realizing that the place you are supposed to feel the safest has been completely compromised. This happened to me during my freshman year at the University of Alabama back in 2013. My assigned roommate Brandon had to cancel last minute due to a family emergency. This left me unpacking all of my boxes alone on my very first weekend. On Sunday night, a guy carrying a simple backpack arrived at my door. He told me his name was Robert, but to call him Bob. He had a deep voice, a slight accent, and an incredibly awkward vibe. His only luggage was a single backpack, and he had no pillows or blankets, just throwing a thin sheet over his bare mattress. I tried to be friendly, but I could not shake a weird feeling about him. That first night, I woke up in the pitch black to see Bob standing directly over my bed, staring down at me in silence. He apologized and claimed he was just going to the bathroom, but my heart was racing. The next day, I felt like someone had gone through my bag. I submitted a room change request, and that night, I checked my email for an update. The housing department had responded, but they expressed total confusion. They stated that they had not assigned me a new roommate yet, and my room was supposed to be empty. I looked over at Bob, who was leaning against the wall, staring at me with his phone screen illuminating his face. I realized he was a completely random intruder who had snuck into my room. I quietly packed my valuables, left the dorm, and called the campus police. By the time they arrived, Bob was gone, along with some of my clothes, a phone charger, and my food. I had shared a locked room with a completely random stranger for a day. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. It was a cold weekend in January of 2016. My close friends and I lived right next to a massive and beautiful nature preserve. In our small town, there is never really much to do on weekends, so we spent our time exploring. On this Saturday, we wanted some adventure. We decided to head down to the massive concrete storm drain that supplied water to the creek inside the preserve. We had seen this place a million times, but we had never actually tried to go inside. The entrance was blocked by a heavy metal barred barricade. It was bolted tightly into the concrete to keep people out. Since we could not get in, we decided to throw some rocks through the bars. We wanted to hear them splash to figure out how deep the drain went. But after throwing one rock, something happened that made our blood run cold. We threw the rock, heard it bounce, and then a couple of seconds of dead silence passed. Suddenly, a terrifying heavy thump rang out from deep within the darkness. It sounded like something had slammed back against the wall in response. It was a loud, angry bang. We stood there in the quiet woods, staring at each other in complete disbelief. Dusk was approaching, so we called it a day and went home. The next weekend, the curiosity was too much. I gathered a few more friends, making 5 of us. We walked back down, stood in front of the barricade, and began unbolting it. Soon, the metal barricade fell down and we entered. We turned on our flashlights. The main tunnel only went about 20 feet to a dead end, but to our left, there was a second branch. We took a step up and proceeded one by one. At first, it was nothing but webs and mud. We walked deep into the drain, about 500 feet, as it kept getting skinnier. We had to duck to move. Suddenly, we all froze. Out of the pitch black, we heard the exact same heavy thump from before. We had no cell signal and were terrified. We were huddled close together, and we knew the sound came from much further down. My friend started recording. We turned around and ran out. Later, when I reviewed the video, my heart stopped. At one turn, there was an outline of a head. It could not have been any of us. I took a screenshot and zoomed in. There in the frame was a demon-shaped head with glowing eyes and pointy ears. We never went back to that place. Our next story takes us to the border city of Laredo, Texas. In this city, there is a very strong, deeply rooted Hispanic culture, which brings with it a lot of local legends and ghost stories. My friends and I had recently picked up a hobby of exploring abandoned warehouses. There were endless rumors surrounding a specific cluster of abandoned industrial buildings near the edge of town. The local myth was that these old warehouses were heavily haunted by the spirits of immigrant workers who had been worked to death and mistreated by their employers years ago. The local news had actually covered the tragic deaths of several workers at these sites over the decades. But many of the incidents were ignored by the authorities due to the illegal status of the laborers. The specific warehouse we decided to visit belonged to an old company that used to maintain railroad tracks and dispose of hazardous materials. When we first walked into the property during the day, we could see massive metal barrels filled with chemical waste that had been left behind, spilled wide open on the concrete floor. We felt very uneasy there. We decided to do a 2-part exploration. First, we checked out the buildings during the day, and then we returned at night. During our daytime walkthrough, we stumbled upon something incredibly disturbing. In a dusty corner, we found the remains of what looked like a satanic ritual. There was a severed chicken foot on the ground, and pentagrams had been drawn on the walls. We also noticed a makeshift bed with old blankets, indicating someone was living there. When we returned that night, the entire energy of the place was different. We got the strong feeling we were being watched. A flock of crows roosting in the rafters started flying down, trying to attack us. We kept moving deeper, trying to ignore them, but we kept seeing dark shadows. Suddenly, a creepy laugh echoed through the room. That laugh was our cue to get out. We turned and ran, but as we passed the spot with the chicken foot, we noticed something that made our stomachs drop. The chicken foot and the drawings were completely gone. Someone had cleaned them up, which meant we were not alone. As we scrambled outside, the crows chased us into the night. We never went back. We realized that the people performing those dark rituals had been hiding in the shadows, watching us the entire night. Now let us move on to a story that took place at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. I was a freshman at the time, living in the campus dorms and trying to adjust to college life. One weekend, a group of my friends came back to the dorms late at night after attending a hockey team party. They brought a few girls along with them who they had known back in high school and who happened to be visiting the city. We all gathered in one of the dorm rooms to hang out. One of the girls who came with them was incredibly friendly, smiling and talking to everyone, but she was also extremely drunk. However, the strange thing was that I never actually saw her take a single drink while she was inside our dorm. At around 2 o'clock in the morning, my girlfriend and I decided it was time to leave, so we walked back to my own room. About an hour later, at 3 in the morning, I was startled by the sound of loud sirens. I looked out my window and could see the flashing red and blue lights of emergency vehicles reflecting off the campus buildings. At first, I did not think much of it. In a college dorm, it is very common for someone to come home with severe alcohol poisoning. But then, a sound ripped through the quiet hallway that I will never forget. It was the most gut-wrenching, agonizing scream I have ever heard. I opened my door and stepped out. My friends came running, their faces pale, screaming for my help. I followed them, and as we got closer, I noticed bright red blood smeared on the floor. I thought someone had been stabbed, but when I looked inside, I saw 3 police officers and paramedics struggling to strap the friendly girl onto a stretcher. She was thrashing violently, growling like an animal, and bleeding heavily from both nostrils. My friend said that out of nowhere, her eyes rolled back and she started growling. She had suddenly turned violent, attacking our friends, pulling their hair and trying to bite them. This girl was only 5 feet tall and weighed 110 pounds, but she displayed absolute superhuman strength, fighting off 3 muscular men. Our resident advisor came over and began to pray. The moment he started praying, she went into a frenzy, screaming profanities and yelling that the devil was coming for all of us. She screamed that they are coming for us next. She later woke up with no memory of what happened, but we will never forget the terror of that night. It was a terrible experience. Our final story comes from a small, quiet town where winters are long and there is almost nothing for teenagers to do. My friend Drake and I had to make our own fun. One cold afternoon, after we finished ice fishing, we went back to my house. The snow was falling heavily, and we decided it would be fun to pass the time by throwing snowballs at passing cars. Usually, people would just ignore us or get a little annoyed, but nobody ever got truly angry. It was just harmless winter fun. But on this day, we picked the wrong car. Drake decided to throw one last snowball at a car coming down the road, and he told me to record it on my phone. He hid right by the passenger side of my driveway and threw it. The snowball made a loud, hard impact as it hit the side of the car. We stood there laughing for a second, but our laughter quickly died when we saw the brake lights turn on. The driver slowed down, came to a complete stop, and then aggressively threw the car into reverse. We knew we had to run now. We panicked. We ran as fast as we could and hid behind a car parked in a nearby empty parking lot. The angry driver pulled into the same lot, stopping just 5 feet away from where we were crouching. Luckily, he did not see us through the falling snow. As soon as he turned his head, we bolted back to my house, ran inside, and locked the front door. We took off our heavy winter jackets and sat down on the couch, trying to catch our breath and watch the video I had just recorded. But before we could even press play, we were interrupted by a massive, violent boom. Someone was pounding on our front door with incredible force. I froze in my seat. I did not think there was any way this guy could have tracked us back to my house. My dog started barking frantically and going absolutely crazy. Drake and I were only 14 years old. We usually did not get scared easily, but this was different. The banging was so loud it felt like the door was going to splinter open. We were completely terrified. We locked ourselves in the bathroom and turned off the light. We tried to laugh, but the banging would not stop. I called my mom, who was at the Walmart. She was angry at us, but said she would call a neighbor to scare him. Suddenly, the banging at the front door stopped, but then the same violent pounding started at our back door. I realized that I had forgotten to lock it. My mom called back, her voice trembling. She said a neighbor saw a deranged man peering through my window. Drake and I ran to her room to grab the old shotgun, but when we stepped inside, we froze. There, pressed against the window, was a hairy, withered face staring at us. We screamed and ran. Drake grabbed my speaker and blasted a police siren. Just as the siren wailed, we heard the back door swing open. The man was inside, but the loud siren sound did the trick. We heard him scramble back and flee. Moments later, our neighbor Paul arrived and stayed with us until the police arrived. The police told us we got lucky. You never know who you are dealing with. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. This story started the way most gym friendships start. You see the same guy a lot. You nod at each other. After a while, you stop pretending you do not recognize them. You just say, "What is up?" like it is no big thing. I was going to my gym almost every day after work. It was the same time and the same routine. It was the only part of my day that felt predictable. I worked an office job that was highly stressful, so the gym was my only escape. One of the regulars was a guy named Josh. He had that look like he wanted people to see him as a serious lifter. He was always in some kind of tight-fitted shirt. He always carried a neon green shaker bottle and walked around with a massive black duffel bag. He was there so often it felt like he actually lived in the building. At first, it was just small stuff. It was a head nod when we passed each other near the dumbbells. That is pretty normal gym etiquette. You see the same faces long enough, and it starts to feel rude not to acknowledge them. Josh seemed friendly enough at first. He would smile and do that quick chin-up thing like we were already friends. But we really were not. We had never spoken a single word to each other. One day I was about to do bench press. He was already on the bench in the next rack over. He looked over and asked if I could spot him. That was the moment it actually transitioned into something else. I said, "Sure." I stood behind the bench while he unracked the bar. He had 2 plates on each side, which is 225 pounds. He was strong, I will give him that. He did a few reps and he struggled on the last one. I placed my hands under the bar and helped guide it back onto the rack. He sat up and then he started talking immediately. It was like he had been waiting for this moment for a long time. He asked me how long I had been lifting. He asked what my workout split was. It was just basic gym talk. I told him my routine and he told me his. He talked incredibly fast. I could tell he had a lot of high energy. He asked where I was from. He asked what I did for work. He asked if I lived close to the gym. I kept my answers basic because I do not like giving out personal details. I did not give him my address. I just told him the general area. He said he lived not far from me. He laughed like that was absolute proof we were meant to be best friends. Before I went back to my set, he asked if I had Instagram. He held out his phone pretty casually. So, I just followed him back. It did not seem like a big deal at the time. People exchange socials all the time now. It is like the modern version of swapping phone numbers. For the next couple of weeks, it was the same routine but slightly different. If Josh was at the gym, he would come over and say, "What is up?" He would ask what I was training that day. He would comment on my form. He acted like he was coaching me, even though I never asked for his advice. It was not offensive, but it was definitely a little much. I figured he was just one of those guys who treated the gym like a community center. He would send me Instagram direct messages sometimes. They were mostly gym memes, dumb videos of guys failing lifts, or edits of bodybuilders with dramatic music playing. I would just react with a laughing emoji and keep it moving. I did not want to be rude. He seemed like he just wanted a gym buddy. Then he messaged me one day, saying there was a local festival happening that weekend. He said we should go together. I did not even know about the festival. I looked it up online. It was one of those town festivals with food trucks, cheap drinks, random vendors, and live music. The crowd was half families and half people who were just there to get buzzed in the middle of the day. I hesitated, but I said sure. It sounded like something to do on a boring Saturday. I figured it would be a quick hangout. If it was awkward, I could easily make an excuse and leave early. When the day came, I met him there in the afternoon. The first thing I noticed was how different he seemed outside the gym environment. At the gym, he had that controlled, focused energy. Outside, it was like he had no volume knob at all. He was incredibly loud from the very moment I saw him. He came up grinning way too hard. He slapped me on the shoulder and started talking like we were reuniting after years apart. Then he started doing these weird voices. They were cartoon voices. Some were high-pitched and nasal. Others were suddenly deep and scratchy. He would say normal sentences, but in a voice like he was doing an impression. It did not fit the situation at all. It was not like we were telling jokes and he was doing characters. He just kept switching voices for no reason. It was like he could not help himself. At first I laughed because it caught me off guard. It was so random that it was kind of funny, but then it just kept going and going. We got drinks and walked around the festival. It was like the alcohol flipped a switch inside him. His jokes got more inappropriate. They were not clever, they were just for shock value. He would point at random people in the crowd and make comments that you should not say out loud. Especially not around families with young kids. He kept trying to make me laugh by saying things that would get him punched if the wrong person heard them. I found myself doing that tight smile thing. I laughed a little bit to keep the peace, but I was also looking around to see if anyone heard him. He did not seem to care at all. He would look right at people while saying these things. It was like he wanted them to react. A couple of times I told him to chill out. I said calm down. He would just laugh and slide into another voice. It was a creepy whisper. He would say my name like it was part of the joke, Nolan. He said it in this fake, spooky tone. He did it more than once. It was weird how much he liked saying my name. Still, the festival was busy and loud. I told myself it was just him being socially awkward and trying too hard. Some people have no filter once they start drinking. I did not want to judge him too harshly off one day. We ended up staying for a couple of hours. I went home thinking he was strange but probably harmless. After that day, he kept messaging me even more. He started sending direct messages that were less like memes and more like constant check-ins. He would ask what I was doing. He would ask if I was going to the gym later. He would ask if I wanted to link up again. At first, I answered his messages, but then I slowed down. I am not the type of person who wants to be texting all day with a guy I barely know. He asked me to go out to a bar one weekend. He said he had invited 2 girls to meet us there. That made it feel more normal. I thought, okay, we are just going out to a bar. There will be other people there. It will not be just the 2 of us. So I agreed to go. We met at the bar at night. Josh showed up already buzzed. I could tell right away. He had that half-there look in his eyes and too much confidence. We ordered drinks, and about 10 minutes passed. Then 20 minutes passed. No one else showed up. I asked about the girls. He said they bailed. He said it like it was nothing. He said it like it happened all the time. Meanwhile, he had hyped this up almost like it was a double date. I felt like he had lied the entire time about the girls just to get me to show up. That thought landed in my stomach and stayed there. Then the voices started again. It was even worse this time. He was not just doing cartoon voices anymore. He was making these creepy, exaggerated sounds. He would do a fake laugh, then a fake cry, and then switch into a deep voice like a movie villain. He would incorporate these sounds and voices into the conversation we were having. It was so weird. He kept doing it right at the table while people around us were trying to have normal conversations. I saw a couple at the bar look over at us and smirk. It was not because they thought he was funny. It was because it was awkward. They were watching someone make a fool of themselves. Josh seemed to notice their looks. Instead of stopping, he leaned into it. He got louder. He started telling jokes that did not even make sense. Then he laughed at himself way too hard. Every time I tried to bring the conversation back to something normal, he would interrupt me with another voice. Then he started saying my name again. Nolan. Listen, Nolan. It was like he could not talk without anchoring me to him. I felt embarrassed sitting there. I did not want people to think I was with him. I felt like he made me look like a weirdo by association. His energy was so off that it made me feel trapped. People were watching us. The bartender looked very annoyed. She looked like she thought he was overly drunk and was considering kicking him out. Josh kept drinking anyway. He ordered shots and tried to get me to do them with him. I said no. He acted like I was betraying him. He made a joke about me being boring. Then he did a voice like a crying baby. I forced a laugh, but inside I wanted to get out of there so bad. I looked at my phone and made the decision that I was leaving. I told him I had to go help my brother with something. It was the first excuse that came to my mind. Josh stared at me for a second. It was like he did not believe me. His face changed completely. He looked genuinely annoyed. He looked like I had just ruined his entire night. He asked why I could not just stay. I repeated that I had to go. He said something under his breath. Then he did that fake laugh again, but it sounded angry this time. I stood up, said I would see him at the gym, and walked out. He did not even say goodbye. People looked at me as I left the bar. I knew it was because we had been a spectacle in there because of him. On the drive home, I felt an intense sense of relief. It was like I had been holding my breath for an hour. I told myself that was it. I was never hanging out with him again. Gym acquaintances is one thing. This was something else entirely. The next time I went to the gym, I saw him. I tried to avoid eye contact. I stayed on the other side of the gym. I hoped he would not notice me. Of course he did. He came up behind me while I was re-racking dumbbells. He said, "What is up?" He said it like nothing had happened. He was overly friendly again. It was like the bar night did not even exist in his memory. He asked why I left so early. I shrugged and said I had to help my brother. He asked if my brother was good. I said yeah. Then he started talking about going out again. He was already trying to set up the next hangout. I kept my answers very short. I told him I had a lot going on. He did not take the hint. He stayed right there talking while I tried to move through my workout. He followed me from one station to another. It was like he was glued to me. Every time I tried to end the conversation, he would start a new one. It felt like he had decided I was his person now, and he was not letting go. After that day, I started changing my gym times. I would go earlier or later just to avoid him. Sometimes it worked and sometimes it did not. When I did not see him, I felt much better. But then I would get messages on Instagram more than before. If I did not open them, he would send another. If I left him on read, he would send messages asking, "You good?" I started not opening my direct messages at all. I hated the feeling of seeing his name pop up on my screen. It was like a knot in my stomach every single time. I thought that if I ignored him long enough, he would get bored and move on to someone else. One night, I was in my room, lying in bed. I was trying to fall asleep. It was a hot summer night. My window was cracked open a little bit. My room is on the first floor of the house, facing the backyard. Suddenly, I heard something outside. It was a low and drawn-out voice. It sounded like someone trying to sound spooky on purpose. It said my name, Nolan. It was not loud, but it was right outside. It was close enough that it felt like it was directly under my window. Then after that, there was just the sound of the wind. The abrupt stop made it even more unsettling. I sat up in bed. I listened hard, but I heard nothing else. I got up and went to the window. I looked through the blinds. Though I could not see anyone, I felt someone's presence out there. I cannot explain the feeling. I whispered through the window. I asked if it was Josh. I did not mean to say his name out loud, but it slipped out because that was who the voice sounded like. When there was no answer, I backed away from the window. I grabbed my phone. My first thought was, how would he even know where I lived? I had never told him my address. I had never posted it online. I went to Instagram and messaged him. I asked if he was outside my house. I stared at the screen after I sent it. I felt stupid, but I needed to know. The message showed that it was seen a few minutes later. That made it even worse. He saw the message and did not answer right away. I watched those little seconds pass like they were hours. Then he replied with one single word. No, that was it. It felt incredibly fishy. I did not understand why he would not respond with something more. At the very least, he should have asked why I was asking that. I did not respond to his message. I put my phone down and tried to forget about it. The next day, he messaged me again. He asked why I was being cold and distant. I did not answer him. I did not want to have a conversation. I did not want to give him anything to latch onto, but that night I heard it again. This time it was not right outside my window. It was in my backyard, farther back. It sounded like someone standing near the fence line. It was the same intentionally creepy voice. It was the same fake tone. It was meant to scare me. It sounded exactly like Josh doing one of his weird voices. He said my name again, slow and stretched out Nolan. Then it stopped abruptly, as if he noticed movement inside the house. I got up and walked to the window fast. I pulled the blinds aside and stared out into the yard. The backyard looked completely empty. I closed the blinds. I locked the window. Even though it was hot, I shut it completely. I turned my fan up to full blast so I would not hear any other sounds. Then I picked up my phone and messaged Josh again. This time I did not ask him if he was there. I told him that if he did not leave, and if he ever came back, I would contact the police and get a restraining order. I ended the message by calling him a freak. I blocked him right after sending it. I set my phone down and told myself that was the end of it. I had drawn a line. He would get scared off. That is what normal people do when they get threatened with the police. But Josh was clearly not normal. I lay there staring at the ceiling. I could not sleep. Even with the fan on full blast, my ears were still searching for sounds outside. A part of me felt this awful curiosity. It was like if I did not check the window, I would be blindsided. I rolled over and carefully lifted the blinds just a little bit. Through the small gaps, I saw a figure standing close to the window. It was a shadow outline standing completely still. It was so close to the glass that it blocked some of the faint light from outside. I yelled loud right at the window. I told him to get out and never come back. The figure shifted away from the window and disappeared into the dark. I stood there shaking. I listened for the sound of the backyard gate closing, but there was just silence. After that night, I did not feel safe in my own room anymore. Every sound outside made me think he was back. I stopped going to that gym completely. I did not want him to see my routine. I signed up at a different gym across town, even though it was more expensive and further away. I stopped posting on Instagram for a while. I kept my blinds closed at night. I started checking the locks on the doors obsessively. 3 weeks passed and nothing happened. I started to relax a little bit. Then one morning, I walked out to my car. I saw that my rear tire was flat. I crouched down and saw the cut. It was a clean slice in the sidewall. He had slashed my tire. I looked up and down the street. It was like I expected him to be standing there watching me. I did not confront Josh. He was blocked anyway. I knew confronting him would only feed into whatever this was. If he did slash my tire, it meant he was still watching me. It meant he wanted a reaction from me. I did not want to give him one. I got the tire replaced. That same day, I bought security cameras. I installed ring cameras around the house, both in the front and the back. I put motion lights in the backyard. I did not like spending the money, but I liked the idea of being blind even less. I kept a low profile after that. I stopped going out late. I did not take the same route home every day. I would check the Ring app every single time I got a motion notification. The worst part about all of this was knowing that a guy I met in the most normal place, a guy I just tried to be friendly to, had developed this disturbing obsession with me after hanging out only twice. Once someone like that decides you are their friend, or that you hold any sort of relationship with them, good luck getting them out of your life. So my advice is to be very careful who you let into your life at all. My name is Louis. I am 22 years old and I live in a small town in Kansas. It is a very safe town. I have lived here for almost 14 years now. I work at a local Mexican restaurant, and I have been doing that job for 4 years. It is not a bad job at all. I go to the gym every single day with my friend Colton. Colton is 19. He is your typical redneck kind of guy, but he is very chill and he is a good friend to have. This whole thing happened last summer. Colton had been dating a girl who was a cheerleader from the local high school. Her name was Addie. She was 17 years old. They met on a dating app and they dated for about 4 months. Their relationship was toxic to say the least. They fought over the smallest things constantly. She did not even like him going to the gym with me. She wanted him to be with her all the time. Eventually, Colton found out that she had cheated on him. She had cheated with multiple guys. That was the final straw for him. He broke up with her. She did not take the breakup well at all. One Tuesday night, Colton and I were at the gym like usual. We normally go around 7 in the evening because he gets off work at 6. We were drinking our pre-workout and starting our lifting session. The gym door opened and a girl walked in. She was wearing a red hoodie and blue leggings. Right away, something felt off about her. She just stood near the door for a second, staring directly at us. She was not looking around the gym. She was not moving or looking at her phone. She just stared. Then she walked towards the women's locker room, but she kept looking back at us as she walked. Colton did not really think much of it at the time, but I did. It felt strange. A few minutes later, we started hearing noises coming from the women's locker room. It sounded like crying mixed with whispering. It was loud enough that we could actually hear it through our headphones. It was not a normal kind of crying. It sounded very unstable. It sounded like someone talking to themselves while breaking down. We tried to ignore the noise and just kept working out. About 10 minutes later, she came out of the locker room. She was wearing the exact same clothes. That is when it got even stranger. Usually, if you go into the locker room, you are changing into gym clothes to work out. But she had not changed at all. She just walked out and started moving around the gym floor. She was not actually using any of the equipment. She kept drifting closer to us. She was getting way too close. She was hovering near whatever machine we were using. She was just watching us. She was not even really working out at all. I told Colton that I was getting really uncomfortable. We decided to move to another machine on the other side of the room. A few minutes later, she was gone. We did not actually see her leave the building. We just realized that she was not there anymore. We finished our workout around 8:40 in the evening. We went outside and stood in the parking lot to talk for a bit. I noticed a car sitting in the parking lot with its lights turned on. That felt weird because there were only 4 other people in the gym at that time. They had all come together in one truck. But we brushed it off and did not think much of it. About 10 minutes after I got back to my house, Colton texted me. He asked if I remembered that girl from the gym. I texted back and said, yeah. He asked, what if it was Addie? That idea made my stomach drop instantly. He said she had been acting crazy since the breakup. He said she really wanted him back. I told him there was no way it was her. I said it was probably just some random girl who was having a bad day. Eventually, we both convinced ourselves that it was not her. We went to bed. Around 11:30 that night, I heard a knocking sound. It was coming from my brother's bedroom window. I got up to look outside, but I did not see anyone out there. A few minutes later, there was knocking on my own bedroom window. Again, when I looked, no one was there. Then, I heard very aggressive knocking at the front door. The front door knob started shaking violently. This was not someone gently checking if the door was unlocked. This was someone trying to force their way inside. Then I heard a girl laughing outside. It was not a normal, playful kind of laughter. It was completely hysterical. Every few seconds she would start laughing again. It sounded like she was really enjoying herself. I started feeling sick to my stomach. Then my phone buzzed. I looked down and saw a text from a random, unknown number. The message told me to leave Colton alone. It said that I was the one who convinced him to break up with her. It said that now I would pay the consequences. I knew immediately that it was Addie. Another text message came in right after. This one was a picture. It was a picture of a knife held in her hand. That was the moment it became very real. She was not just angry. She was standing outside my house with a weapon. I texted my dad. Thankfully, he was still awake in his room. He called the police immediately. The laughter outside stopped after a few minutes, but I was too scared to move. I did not want to check the windows. When the police officers arrived at the house, they found her. She was sitting in the grass near the side of the house. It looked like she had just been sitting there waiting. They arrested her on the spot. She admitted everything to the officers. They asked me if I wanted to press charges against her. I said yes, absolutely. I called Colton and told him everything that had happened. He was just glad that I was okay. The only thing that I still do not understand is how she got my address. I had never given it to her. Colton swears that he did not give it to her either. That part still really bothers me. If she was able to find it once, she could have found it at any time. I am just incredibly glad that the police got there when they did. I am 25 years old, and I had been going to the same LA Fitness in my town for a few years. I usually went there after work, around 6 o'clock in the evening. After you go to the same gym for a while, you start recognizing the regulars. Even if you never actually talk to them, you know their faces. About 6 months ago, I started noticing a guy I had never seen before. The first time I really noticed him was during one of my leg day workouts. I was doing squats. When I finished a set, I looked up at the mirror in front of me. I saw him sitting on a chest press machine directly behind me. He was not using the machine. He was just sitting there. He was leaning forward with his elbows resting on his knees. He was looking straight ahead. But when I started another set of squats and looked up at the mirror again, he was still sitting in that exact same position. Now he was staring directly in my direction. When our eyes met in the mirror, he quickly looked away. The next time I saw him was a couple of days later. I was doing shoulder presses. I noticed him sitting on a lat pull-down machine across the room. Again, he was not actually using the machine. The weight stack was not moving at all. He had been sitting there the entire time I was working out. Every single time I glanced over in that direction, I caught him looking at me. He would quickly turn his head away when he saw me look. After that, I started noticing him almost every single time I went to the gym. The weirdest part of all was that I never actually saw him work out. I never saw him lift a single weight. He would just sit on different machines or benches. But he never moved the weights. One night, I was doing squats again. I noticed him standing behind me. He was holding his phone up in front of his chest. The phone was angled directly toward me. For a second, it looked exactly like he was recording a video of me. The moment I turned around and stared directly at him, he lowered the phone and looked away. That was the moment I started feeling genuinely uncomfortable. Over the next week, I kept seeing him. Sometimes he would be sitting near the free weight area. Sometimes he would be on a machine across the room. But no matter where I went in the gym, He always seemed to position himself to have a clear view of me. One night, I went to refill my water bottle at the fountain. When I turned the corner toward the fountain, he was suddenly standing right there. He was only a few feet away from me. It startled me because I had never been that physically close to him before. He looked down the moment he realized I noticed him. He quietly walked past me without saying a single word. After that encounter, I decided that I needed to change my routine. Instead of going to the gym around 6 o'clock like I usually did, I started going much later. I started going around 9 o'clock at night. The gym is a lot quieter at that time. I figured that if he had a normal work schedule, he probably would not be there that late. The first night I tried this new schedule, I walked in and scanned the room right away. He was not there. The same thing happened for the next few nights. I was so relieved. I thought that maybe I had solved the problem. Then, one weekend, my friends and I went out to a bar downtown. It was a Saturday night. The bar was crowded and very loud, like most places downtown on the weekend. And there he was. I turned around while my friends and I were standing near the back of the room. I saw the guy sitting completely alone at a small table near the wall. It took me a second to realize it was the exact same guy from the gym. He was wearing a dark jacket and a baseball hat. The hat was pulled low over his face. When I noticed him, he was staring directly at me. The second he realized I had seen him, he looked down at his drink. Over the next 20 minutes, I caught him looking at me several more times. Each time he would quickly look away. Eventually, I leaned toward my friends. I told them that I wanted to go somewhere else. We left the bar and walked a few blocks to a different place. I did not see him again that night, but the whole situation stayed in my mind. It made me feel very uneasy. The scariest moment of all happened 2 weeks later. There is a nature preserve near my house. It has a long dirt trail that I sometimes run during the day. It was a cloudy afternoon when I started my run on the dirt path. The path leads deeper into the woods of the preserve. About 10 minutes into my run, I noticed someone jogging behind me. At first, it did not seem unusual. It is a public trail after all. But after a minute, I realized that the distance between us was not changing at all. He stayed the exact same distance behind me the entire time. I decided to slightly increase my pace. Within seconds, I heard his footsteps speed up behind me too. I sped up again. He did the exact same thing. When I glanced back briefly, I saw a man wearing a hat with his head down. He was jogging behind me. His physical build looked exactly like the guy from the gym. That was when the adrenaline kicked in. I knew there was a small dirt exit path up ahead. It led to a nearby residential street if you took a sharp left. I started running faster and faster. I was almost sprinting. His footsteps got much louder behind me. When I turned onto the narrow dirt path leading up to the street, I heard him break into a full sprint behind me. I ran as fast as I possibly could. When I reached the street, I started screaming for help at the top of my lungs. A man who had been standing in his driveway across the road immediately looked over at me. The second the guy behind me saw that there was someone else there, he stopped. He stopped right at the edge of the trail. I turned around and saw him hesitate for a moment. Then he turned around and ran back into the woods. The man from the driveway came over to check on me. He stayed with me while I tried to catch my breath and calm down. By the time I looked back toward the trail, the guy was completely gone. I never saw him at the gym again after that day. A few weeks later, I decided to cancel my membership at that LA Fitness. I joined a different gym across town. This entire experience definitely made me a whole lot more paranoid in public settings. It made me pay much closer attention to who is watching me. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. When you decide to pack a bag and head out into the deep woods all by yourself, you are making a choice to leave the safety of civilization behind. Most of the time, people do this because they want to find peace and quiet. They want to escape the noise of the city, the stress of their jobs, and the constant pressure of daily life. They expect to find nothing but trees, mountains, and the soothing sounds of nature. But the deep woods can be incredibly isolating, and that isolation can quickly turn into a trap. When you are miles away from the nearest road, with no cell service and no one around to hear you scream, you are completely on your own. If something goes wrong, or if you run into someone who does not want you there, your peaceful escape can instantly become a fight for your life. The first story we are going to look at today comes from a man who spent years backpacking alone in the wilderness. He was young, in his mid-20s, and he had a tolerance for risk that he looks back on now with sheer disbelief. He loved the feeling of being completely off the grid. He would regularly drive out to remote trailheads, hike deep into the backcountry, and spend days completely disconnected from the rest of the world. His friends and family thought he was insane for doing this, but to him, it was the ultimate way to recharge. This particular trip took place in the Cherokee National Forest, a massive and rugged stretch of wilderness that covers over 600,000 acres of land. For the first 2 days, the trip was absolutely perfect. The weather was clear, the trails were quiet, and he had not seen a single other person since his first morning in the woods. He felt completely relaxed and at ease. But on the afternoon of the second day, things began to change. He was hiking along a high, exposed section of the trail when he noticed dark, heavy storm clouds building up on the western horizon. At first he was not too worried. He was an experienced hiker and had dealt with rain many times before. He figured it would be a passing shower, so he kept moving forward. But within an hour, the temperature began to drop rapidly. The wind picked up, howling through the trees and bending the branches. He realized this was not going to be a light shower. It was a major storm, and it was moving in fast. He stopped to put on another layer of clothing as the first heavy drops of rain began to fall. Within minutes, the sky turned a dark, bruised purple, and the rain turned into a full-blown downpour. The wind was so strong that it was bending smaller trees sideways, and he could hear the ominous sound of branches cracking and falling in the canopy above him. He started getting genuinely concerned about his safety. He was hiking at elevation, and he had a metal-framed backpack on. With lightning starting to strike nearby, he knew he was in a very dangerous position. He needed to find shelter, and he needed to find it fast. He scanned the thick woods on either side of the trail as he pushed forward through the driving rain. And then, as if by some absolute miracle, he saw something through the dense trees off to his left. It was a small, dark shape, partially hidden by the overgrown foliage. He squinted through the rain and realized it was a structure. He immediately left the trail and made his way toward it. As he got closer, he saw that it was a tiny one-story wooden cabin. It looked incredibly old, like an old hunting cabin, or a homesteader shelter from decades ago. The wood was weathered and dark, and there was a single small window on the side he was approaching. He was so relieved to find shelter that he did not hesitate. He ran up to the cabin, grabbed the door handle, and pushed it open. Inside, the cabin was dim, dry, and silent. He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him, shutting out the howling wind and the pounding rain. The air inside was thick and smelled terrible, like damp wood, decay, and old dust, but he did not care about the smell. He was just incredibly grateful to be out of the storm. He looked around and saw that the cabin was mostly empty. There was a single wooden chair, a small table, and an old metal cot frame pushed against the far wall. On the right side of the room, there was a stone fireplace that was completely clogged with old ash and forest debris. He was in survival mode at this point, exhausted and soaked to the bone. He stripped off his wet outer layers, dropped his heavy pack, and decided to lie down right there on the wooden floor to rest. For about 15 minutes, he just lay there, listening to the rain drumming furiously against the roof. But once his breathing slowed down and his adrenaline began to fade, his curiosity got the better of him. He reached into his pack, pulled out his flashlight, and clicked it on. He decided to snoop around and see what was left in this old place. As he swept the beam of light across the room, he noticed things he had missed at first glance. In the corner near the cot frame, there was a rolled-up sleeping bag. He walked over to it and shined his light on it. It did not look ancient like the rest of the cabin. It looked relatively modern, although it was covered in a thick layer of dust. On the table, there were a couple of old tin cans and some plastic water jugs. It looked like someone had been using this cabin as a temporary base camp, maybe a hunter or another backpacker. Finding stuff like this in remote cabins was not completely unusual, but then he noticed something else that made him uneasy. Near the doorframe, there were marks on the wall. He moved closer and held his flashlight up to inspect them. They were not natural wear and tear. They were deep scratches, carved into the wood. There were dozens of them, clustered together. with no apparent pattern or order. They looked frantic and desperate. He stepped back and looked closely at the door itself. The door had a simple metal latch on the inside to keep it shut. But when he opened the door slightly to look at the outer frame, he saw something that made his heart skip a beat. Mounted on the outside of the door, and the frame was a heavy metal bracket. It was designed specifically to hold a padlock, and there was no corresponding latch or lock on the inside. That meant the only way to lock this door securely was from the outside. If someone was inside this cabin and that padlock was secured on the outside, they would be completely trapped. He closed the door and felt a sudden wave of anxiety wash over him. He walked over to the single window to inspect it. The glass was perfectly intact, which was surprising given how old and abandoned the cabin looked. But when he shined his light on the edges of the window frame, he saw why. Heavy metal screws had been driven directly through the window frame, into the surrounding wood, one in each corner, securing it completely shut. And just like the padlock bracket, those screws had been driven in from the outside. He looked at the inside of the window frame. There, carved deep into the wood, were more scratches. These scratches were unmistakable. They were deep, jagged gouges that looked exactly like someone had tried to claw their way out. They had tried to pry the window open with their bare hands, desperate to escape. The terrifying reality of the situation hit him all at once. This cabin was not a cozy shelter. It was a prison. Someone had been kept in this room against their will, locked in from the outside, clawing at the walls and the window in a desperate attempt to get free. His instinct told him to leave immediately. He did not want to be in this place for another second, but when he looked out the window, the storm was still raging. The wind was howling, the rain was coming down in sheets, and lightning was cracking across the sky. He looked back at the dusty sleeping bag and the old cans. Everything in the cabin looked like it had been sitting there undisturbed for a very long time. He tried to convince himself that whatever horrific events had happened in this cabin were way in the past. He really did not want to go back out into that freezing, dangerous storm. So, he made the decision to stay. He sat down on the floor, keeping his flashlight turned off to save the battery. The storm showed no signs of slowing down. The sound of the rain on the metal roof was incredibly loud, filling the small cabin with a constant, deafening roar. Because of that noise, it took him a long time to notice the other sound. It started as a faint, rhythmic scraping noise. It was coming from the left wall of the cabin on the outside. At first, he tried to tell himself it was just a tree branch brushing against the exterior wood. But then he remembered looking at the cabin from the outside. There were no low branches near that wall. The area immediately around the cabin was clear. As he was trying to process this, he heard two distinct, heavy thumps on the wooden porch right outside the front door. These were not storm sounds. They were the unmistakable sounds of heavy footsteps. He stood up instantly, his heart hammering against his ribs. He froze in place, doing that thing where you try to focus all your senses by staring at a random spot on the wall. He strained his ears, trying to listen, but the roar of the storm made it impossible to hear anything clearly. He started getting incredibly paranoid. He wondered if those heavy thumps were the only sounds, or if there had been other noises that were simply drowned out by the rain. His eyes drifted over to the window. He wanted to look out, to see if anyone was there, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. The thought of stepping up to that glass and seeing a face looking back at him from the darkness was absolutely terrifying. He stood there, frozen for what felt like an eternity. After a long time, when no other sounds came, he began to relax just a little bit. He told himself that his mind was playing tricks on him. He was tired, he was stressed, and the creepy history of the cabin was making him paranoid. He figured it was just the wind, or maybe a wild animal seeking shelter near the porch. He was just about to let his guard down when he heard a sound that sent a jolt of pure terror straight down his spine. It was the sound of heavy pressure being applied to the front door. It sounded like someone was leaning their entire body weight against the wood from the outside. The old door creaked under the strain, and the metal latch on the inside rattled loudly in its bracket. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the pressure was released. The wood stopped creaking and the latch went silent. His heart rate shot through the roof. In that exact moment, a horrifying thought clicked in his mind. The door was not locked. The person outside did not need to force their way in. There was nothing stopping them from simply turning the handle and walking right into the cabin. So, why were they circling the place? Why were they tapping on the walls, walking on the porch, and leaning against the door without coming inside? It occurred to him that maybe they did not want to come inside. Maybe they wanted him to stay inside. Maybe they were preparing to lock him in. Just like the person who had left those desperate scratch marks on the walls. He decided he was leaving. He did not care about the storm, the rain, or the lightning anymore. Anything was better than being trapped in this cabin. He began stuffing his gear back into his backpack as fast as he could, his hands shaking violently in the dark. He had a sickening feeling in his gut that something terrible was about to happen, and he was absolutely right. The next few moments became a chaotic blur. He was about seconds away from picking up his pack and running out the door when he heard the sound of glass shattering violently behind him. He spun around just in time to see a dark object fly through the broken window. Before he could even process what it was, the entire room erupted into a ball of roaring fire. The flames spread with terrifying speed. 1 second he was standing in a dark, cold cabin, and the next second the walls, the floor, and the ceiling were completely engulfed in fire. The heat hit him like a solid physical wall, scorching his skin and taking his breath away. He grabbed his pack and threw himself toward the front door. He grabbed the handle and pushed, but the door would not budge. It was locked. Someone had jammed it or secured the padlock bracket from the outside. He was trapped in a burning box. With the flames licking at his back, desperation took over. He backed up a step, screamed, and slammed his entire body weight into the wooden door. The old wood splintered, and the door tore completely off its rusted hinges. He tumbled out onto the wet ground of the porch, coughing and gasping for clean air. He scrambled to his feet and did not look back. He ran blindly into the dark woods, the rain pouring down on him as he pushed through the thick brush. He wanted to put as much distance between himself and that burning cabin as humanly possible, but before he could get more than 50 yards away, he felt a heavy weight crash into him from behind. He was tackled hard, slamming face first into the wet mud. Suddenly, he was fighting for his life. There was a person on top of him, pinning him to the ground. In the dark and the rain, he couldn't see the person's face, but he could feel the sheer, violent aggression of the attack. The man was screaming like an absolute maniac, shouting incoherent words as he tried to wrap his arms around the backpacker's neck in a chokehold. The attacker was gouging at his eyes, clawing at his face, and ripping at his hair. The backpacker felt a wave of dizziness wash over him as the pressure on his neck tightened. He realized that if he did not fight back with everything he had, he was going to die in these woods. He began to kick and scratch, throwing his elbows back and bucking his hips. With a surge of adrenaline, he managed to plant his feet and throw the attacker off his back. He scrambled away in the mud, got back up on his feet, and kept running. Behind him, the attacker was still screaming, a raw, animalistic sound that echoed through the dark forest. The backpacker looked back twice as he ran. The first time, he couldn't see the man, but he saw the cabin. It was fully engulfed in flames, a massive, roaring fireball illuminating the dark trees. That image of the burning cabin in the middle of the rain-drenched forest is something that he says is burned into his brain forever. The second time he looked back, the glow of the fire was smaller, obscured by the distance and the thick trees. But he did not slow down. For all he knew, the maniac was still right on his heels, chasing him through the darkness. He kept running until his lungs felt like they were on fire, and his legs completely gave out. He stumbled and fell near a spot where two massive trees had collapsed against each other, creating a narrow, sheltered gap underneath them. He crawled into the small space, pulled his knees to his chest, and collapsed. He was completely numb. He couldn't tell if the numbness was from the freezing rain, the burns on his body, or the sheer shock of the attack. He just sat there in the dark, shivering violently, trying to control his breathing and listening for any sound of footsteps approaching his hiding spot. Hours passed, and time lost all meaning. He sat in that cramped space, terrified to make a sound, waiting for the night to end. Eventually, as the sky began to turn a faint gray, some feeling started to return to his limbs. He knew he couldn't stay there. He told himself that he had to move, or he would die of hypothermia. The attacker could still be out there, searching for him. He crawled out from under the logs and began to walk. He did not know where the trail was, but he did not care. He just picked a direction and kept moving. He was soaked, covered in mud, and bleeding from multiple cuts on his face and hands. Eventually, the rain began to stop, and he was able to orient himself. By some stroke of luck, he stumbled onto a random trail and followed it until he reached a trailhead. He walked out onto a gravel Forest Service road, and the first person who drove by saw his condition and immediately stopped. The driver put him in the car and rushed him to the nearest hospital. The doctors treated him for second-degree burns on his left forearm and the back of his neck. They told him he was incredibly lucky that he had not inhaled more smoke, and that his injuries would heal without permanent damage. But the physical healing was the easy part. When he was safe at home, he tried to make sense of what had happened. He knew without a doubt that someone had intentionally set that cabin on fire to kill him. It was pouring rain, and the cabin had a metal roof. There was absolutely no way a wet wooden structure would go up in flames that fast, unless the wood had been treated with an accelerant beforehand. The attacker had prepared the cabin, waiting for someone to seek shelter inside. He gave the police the coordinates of the cabin and told them everything he could remember. But the cabin was in a remote, uncharted part of the forest, and because there was no physical evidence left after the fire, the investigation quickly stalled. He could tell the police were not going to pursue it. He never went backpacking alone again. He eventually got married and started a family, and to this day, he has never told his wife about what happened to him in the Cherokee National Forest. He knows that if he did, she would never let him go near the woods again, and honestly, he has no desire to ever go back. Our second story takes us back about 7 or 8 years, and it involves a young man named James and his close friend Charles. James and Charles had been friends since high school, and they had a very specific dynamic. Charles was the kind of person who was always looking for adventure, but not the normal kind. He was obsessed with urban exploration. He spent hours on Google Earth and online forums, looking for abandoned buildings, old factories, and places where people were not supposed to go. Most of their friends would hear Charles talk about these places and say it sounded completely insane. But James was different. He had a similar threshold for risk, and whenever Charles would ask him to go on one of these trips, James would usually agree. This dynamic led to some incredible memories, but it also got them into some extremely dangerous situations. One weekend, Charles texted James about a fire lookout tower he had found deep in a forest. James cannot remember the name of the forest, but it was about a 3-hour drive from where they lived. Charles explained that the tower had been decommissioned decades ago and was just sitting out in the middle of nowhere, completely untouched. He wanted to hike out to it, climb to the top, and spend the night in the cab. James was skeptical at first. Usually, structures like that are fenced off, locked up, or heavily protected, but Charles assured him that this one was totally open. The idea of being 70 feet up in the air, in the middle of a silent forest, with a 360-degree view of the stars, sounded too good to pass up. They decided to make it happen. They drove out early on a Friday morning. Charles had planned the route, which involved a 4-mile hike off the trail through the thick woods. James was half expecting them to get lost, or to find that the tower had been torn down. But after hours of hiking through the trees, they suddenly saw it. Rising high above the canopy was the massive steel frame of the tower. Seeing it in person was breathtaking. It was incredibly tall, and as they got closer, James was amazed to see that Charles was right. There were no fences, no warning signs, and no security. It was just sitting there, abandoned, in the middle of the wilderness. At the very top of the tower was the cab, a small square room with glass windows on all 4 sides. A metal staircase zigzagged up the steel frame, ending in a vertical ladder section that led straight up into the floor of the cab. The structure looked very old. Some of the lower handrails were bent or completely missing, and there was graffiti sprayed on the support beams near the base. It did not look like the sturdiest thing in the world, and James started to have second thoughts. But Charles was already starting to climb, completely filled with excitement. James told him to be careful, took a deep breath, and began to climb up behind him. They moved slowly and cautiously, checking each metal step before putting their weight on it. Most of the stairs were solid, but there were several spots where the bolts had rusted completely through, causing the steps to wobble under their feet. The final stretch was the most terrifying part. It was a 20-foot vertical ladder with nothing but a narrow metal cage around it to keep you from falling. The adrenaline was pumping hard, but they made it to the top without any issues. The view from the cab was absolutely unbelievable. They could see for miles in every direction, with nothing but green forest stretching out to the horizon. The sun was about an hour from setting, and the sky was filled with brilliant shades of orange and red. There was a narrow wooden walkway that wrapped around the outside of the cab, secured by a metal railing. They decided to sit out on the walkway, crack open a couple of beers, and watch the sun go down. It was incredibly peaceful. As the sun finally disappeared, the sky transitioned from orange to dark blue, and then to pitch black. Because they were so far from any towns or cities, there was no light pollution. The stars were brighter and clearer than anything James had ever seen before. But as the darkness settled in, the forest below them disappeared into a deep black void. It was a little unsettling, knowing there was a massive forest right beneath them, but being unable to see a single foot of it. Charles could tell that James was getting a bit nervous, so he started messing with him. He would grab James by the shoulder, or make sudden movements to startle him. But then, Charles did something that genuinely pissed James off. Charles took his heavy metal water bottle and smacked it hard against the steel frame of the tower. The sound was incredibly loud. It was a sharp, metallic clang that echoed out into the silent forest, carrying for miles in every direction. The sound was so loud and ominous that James immediately yelled at him to stop. He told Charles that was incredibly stupid and that he wanted to go inside the cab. Charles finally got the hint and stopped joking around. They went inside the small square room. It had been completely gutted years ago, so there was nothing inside but bare wooden floors. Charles decided to stay out on the walkway to finish his beer, while James picked a corner and started setting up his sleeping bag. But before James could finish, he heard Charles call his name in a very quiet, serious voice. It was completely different from Charles's normal, playful tone. He told James to come outside right away. James walked out onto the walkway and saw Charles pointing diagonally down toward the forest below them. At first, James thought his friend was just trying to scare him again, but then he saw it. There was a light down in the trees. It was faint, and it was pretty far away, but it was definitely there. It was a single point of light, weaving slowly through the dense forest. James's first thought was that it was a ranger or a landowner who had heard the loud metallic clang Charles had made. He felt a wave of panic, realizing they were probably about to get caught and arrested for trespassing. He whispered to Charles, telling him how stupid he was for making that noise. But Charles just stared at the light, his expression deadly serious. He looked at James and asked, with a trembling voice, if James really thought that was a person. James was confused. He asked what else it could be. Charles pointed out that the light was moving way too smoothly. When a person walks through the woods with a flashlight or a lantern, the light bounces, sways, and shakes as they step over roots, rocks, and branches. But this light was not doing that. It was moving in a perfectly even, level line, as if it were floating or hovering through the trees at a steady walking pace. They stood there in silence, watching the light. James tried to convince himself that it was just a normal hiker, but deep down, he knew something was wrong. And as they watched, the light began to get closer. It was definitely heading straight for the tower. Suddenly, the light did something that made James's palms start to sweat. The woods were incredibly thick, but for a split second, the light went from a slow, steady crawl to an abrupt, blinding zip forward. It was as if it skipped a chunk of space in the blink of an eye. Then it went right back to its slow, steady hover. But Charles was visibly terrified. He asked James what they should do, but James had no answer. They were 70 feet in the air, and their only way down was the metal staircase. If they tried to climb down now, they would be walking directly toward whatever was coming. They were completely trapped. They watched in absolute silence as the light slowly made its way to the base of the tower. Within 10 minutes, it was directly beneath them. From their high vantage point, they could see the bright glow illuminating the ground right under the tower's support beams. But because the light was so bright, they couldn't see who or what was holding it. It was just a glowing sphere of light, sitting perfectly still. They stared at it for what felt like hours, waiting for something to happen. They expected a voice to yell up to them, demanding they come down. But there was nothing, just absolute silence, and the cold, unmoving light directly below them. The suspense was agonizing. And then, Charles did another incredibly stupid thing. He leaned over the railing and yelled down into the dark, asking if whoever was down there was okay. James looked at him in horror, unable to believe Charles would reveal their presence like that. But there was no response from the dark. The light did not move, and no one answered. Charles waited a minute and yelled down again, but still there was only silence. They were stuck in a nightmare. They couldn't leave, and they couldn't get any answers. They watched the light for another 30 minutes. It never flickered, and it never moved an inch. Eventually, James decided he couldn't just stand there. He grabbed his own high-powered flashlight, aimed it straight down at the base of the tower, and clicked it on. But even with the powerful beam of his flashlight cutting through the dark, he couldn't see anything. The mysterious light seemed to absorb the beam, and there was no physical figure visible on the ground. They realized there was nothing they could do but wait. They decided to go back inside the cab, but James made sure to keep his eyes glued to the windows, watching the light below. Charles tried to rationalize it, saying it was probably just an LED light that someone had placed there to play a prank on them. But James knew that made no sense. Who would hike miles into the middle of an abandoned forest just to set up a light to scare two random guys? And then, as James was staring down, the light suddenly vanished. There was no warning, and no sound of footsteps running away. The light just blinked out of existence, leaving the ground below in pitch-black darkness. Charles seemed relieved, thinking that whoever it was had finally left. But James felt the exact opposite. The only thing worse than seeing the threat was knowing it was still down there, completely invisible in the dark. James insisted that they spend the rest of the night inside the wooden cab with the door closed, and Charles agreed. They crawled inside, lay down in their sleeping bags, and stared at the dark ceiling. Neither of them had any intention of falling asleep. That turned out to be the best decision they could have made. About 20 minutes after they went inside, they started hearing noises. It started with a sharp, metallic clang that vibrated through the wooden floorboards. It was the unmistakable sound of metal striking metal, echoing up through the steel support beams of the tower. James listened intently, trying to figure out if it was footsteps. But it was not footsteps. It sounded like someone was hitting one of the main structural beams with a heavy iron tool, like a wrench or a crowbar. A few minutes later, another sound came. This one was a horrible grinding noise, like heavy metal being twisted and bent under extreme force. The sound lasted for several seconds, sending vibrations right through the tower frame before stopping abruptly. They lay there, paralyzed with fear, looking at each other in the dim starlight. The sounds kept coming, on and off, from different parts of the tower. It sounded like someone was working on the structure, moving from one side to the other, slowly dismantling something. James tried to map out the noises in his head, trying to figure out if they were getting closer to the top. But the acoustics of the metal tower made it impossible to tell. Suddenly, as James was staring at the windows on the far side of the cab, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A dark, human-shaped silhouette moved quickly across the glass of the window. It was incredibly fast, passing from one pane of glass to the next. James let out a terrified scream, and Charles scrambled away from the window in panic. They both ran to the wooden door of the cab, pressing their backs firmly against it. They knew that if someone tried to open the door, they would have to push through both of them. They stood there, chests heaving, waiting for the door handle to turn. But the handle never moved. They heard no footsteps on the wooden walkway outside. It was completely silent. They stood in that exact position, backs pressed against the door for the rest of the night. It was the most terrifying, exhausting experience of James's life. Every muscle in his body was tense, waiting for an attack that never came. Finally, the sky began to lighten as the sun started to rise. The darkness slowly faded, replaced by the pale light of morning. James counted to 3, grabbed the door handle, and flung the door open violently, expecting to find someone waiting on the other side. But the walkway was completely empty. They walked around the entire cab, looking down at the ground. There was no sign of anyone. They quickly packed up their sleeping bags, eager to get as far away from the tower as possible, and began their descent. They made it about 3/4 of the way down the metal staircase when Charles suddenly stopped. He just stood on the landing, staring down at the next flight of stairs with a look of absolute disbelief. James pushed past him to see what was wrong, and his jaw dropped. An entire section of the metal staircase was completely gone. It was not just a few steps that had rusted out. A whole 10-foot section of the steel stairs, including the heavy handrails and the support brackets, had been completely removed from the frame. They stood on the landing, looking down at the massive empty gap. Beneath the gap was a 70-foot drop to the forest floor. It was physically impossible for someone to have removed that heavy steel section silently, let alone in the dark. Yet it was gone. They realized that the person, or whatever it was, had literally taken apart their only escape route while they were sleeping at the top. The grinding and clanging sounds they had heard during the night had been the sound of their staircase being dismantled. But how had the figure James saw on the window passed by if the stairs were gone? How had they crossed the gap in the pitch black without falling? There was no time to think about it. They had to get down. The gap was too wide to step across, but they had no other choice. Charles, despite his panic, managed to jump across the empty space, landing hard on the lower section of stairs. He twisted his ankle badly, but he was alive. James threw their packs down and then made the jump himself, landing safely on the rusted metal. They scrambled down the remaining stairs, reached the ground, and did not stop running until they reached their car. They did not see anyone at the base of the tower, and they did not find the missing metal stairs on the ground. It was as if the stairs had simply vanished into thin air. To this day, James and Charles still talk about that night. They have never found an explanation for the floating light, the silent dismantling of the steel stairs, or the figure that passed by the 70-foot-high window. It is a mystery that continues to haunt them both. Our third and final story comes from a highly experienced solo hiker who, at the time of the incident, was in his late 30s. He had been doing solo backpacking trips for over 15 years, so he was no stranger to the risks of the wilderness. He knew how quickly things could go wrong, which is why he always carried a heavy-duty, bolt-action rifle with him whenever he went into the backcountry. This story took place in the Daniel Boone National Forest located in eastern Kentucky. This forest is a massive, incredibly rugged wilderness that covers over 700,000 acres of land. It is filled with deep sandstone gorges, high cliffs, and incredibly dense forests. If you know where to go, you can easily hike for days without ever crossing paths with another human being. He had been going through a very stressful period at work, and his head was not in a good place. He felt a desperate need to get away from civilization, to clear his mind and find some peace. So, on a Thursday morning, he packed his gear, drove out to a remote Forest Service road, and parked his car at a quiet trailhead. His plan was simple. He was going to spend 3 nights deep in the backcountry, completely isolated. He had his tent, a warm sleeping bag, enough food and water for 4 days, and his trusty .308 bolt-action rifle strapped to the side of his pack. The first day of the hike was exactly what he needed. The air was cool, the woods were peaceful, and the physical effort of hiking helped him clear his head. He covered about 7 miles of rough terrain before finding a beautiful, flat clearing near a quiet creek bed. It was the perfect spot to camp. He set up his tent, gathered a large pile of firewood, and had a warm fire going by the time the sun began to sink below the tree line. He cooked a simple meal, drank a beer, and sat by the fire, enjoying the absolute silence of the forest. He had not seen a single trace of another person all day. Around 10 o'clock, as the fire began to burn down to a pile of glowing embers, he crawled into his tent and went to sleep. At some point in the middle of the night, he woke up. He was not sure what had woken him. He did not hear a specific sound. It was more like his brain had just switched on, the way it often does when you are sleeping in an unfamiliar place. He lay perfectly still in his sleeping bag, staring up at the ceiling of his tent, listening to the gentle gurgle of the creek nearby. But as his eyes adjusted to the dark, he noticed something strange. There was a faint, warm, orange glow illuminating the fabric walls of his tent. He knew his own campfire had burned down to cold ash before he went to sleep, so the light couldn't be coming from his camp. He sat up, unzipped the front flap of his tent very slowly, and peered out into the darkness. There, about 200 yards away through the thick trees, he saw a fire. It was not a forest fire. It was small, controlled, and flickering gently, exactly like a typical campfire. He watched it for several minutes, waiting to hear the sound of voices, or to see the shadow of a person moving around it. But the woods were completely silent, and he saw no signs of movement. He figured it was just another camper who had arrived late and set up camp nearby without him noticing. It was a bit annoying, since he had wanted complete isolation, but it was not uncommon. He assumed the camper had gone to sleep and left their fire burning, which was highly irresponsible, but unfortunately quite common. He watched the fire for about 5 more minutes to make sure it wasn't going to spark a larger blaze. When it remained stable, he zipped his tent back up, lay down, and fell back asleep. The next morning, the campfire was the first thing on his mind. He was curious to see who his neighbor was, and he wanted to make sure they had properly extinguished their fire. He packed up his campsite, strapped his rifle to his pack, and began walking in the direction of the clearing where he had seen the light. He was very confident in his navigation. He had a great sense of direction and knew exactly where the clearing should be based on the angle from his tent. Within 10 minutes, he reached the natural clearing, but when he stepped into the open space, he stopped dead in his tracks. The ground was completely untouched. There was no fire pit. There was no ring of stones, no pile of gray ash, no scorched earth, and no charred pieces of wood. The grass and the dirt were perfectly pristine, covered in a natural layer of fallen leaves and pine needles that had clearly not been disturbed in months. He walked the entire perimeter of the clearing, shining his eyes over every foot of the ground, looking for any sign of human activity. He found absolutely nothing. No footprints, no broken twigs, nothing. He stood there completely baffled. He knew what he had seen. He had watched that flickering orange light for several minutes. It had been a real fire. But the physical evidence on the ground said otherwise. He tried to tell himself that he had simply gotten the location wrong, but he knew there were no other clearings in that direction. With a growing sense of unease, he decided to just let it go and keep moving. He was not about to ruin his trip over something he couldn't explain. He turned away from the clearing and continued his hike, heading deeper into the forest. As the day progressed, the terrain became much more rugged and difficult. The gentle creek bed fell away behind him, and the ground began to climb steeply. By mid-afternoon, he had reached a very dense, older section of the forest. The trees here were massive, and the canopy was so thick that it blocked out most of the sunlight, leaving the forest floor in a state of permanent twilight. It was incredibly quiet in there. The birds had stopped singing, and the only sound was the crunch of his own boots on the dry leaves. Around 4 o'clock, he found a decent spot to set up camp for the night. He pitched his tent, made a quick dinner, and decided to turn in early. He extinguished his fire completely, making sure the coals were cold to the touch, and crawled into his sleeping bag around 9 o'clock. He fell into a deep, heavy sleep. He did not know what time it was when the sound woke him, but it was so incredibly loud that it pulled him out of his sleep instantly. It started with a horrific, violent cracking sound that echoed through the dark woods. It sounded like a massive, thick branch of an old-growth tree was being snapped in half under immense pressure. The cracking continued for several seconds, followed by the roaring crash of branches tearing through the canopy, and then a deep, resonant thud shook the ground beneath his tent. He could literally feel the vibration in his chest. He sat up in his sleeping bag, his heart pounding. He knew exactly what that sound was. A massive tree had just fallen somewhere deep in the forest. Hearing a tree fall in the woods is a rare and terrifying thing. The sheer force and weight of it is humbling, and it always triggers a rush of adrenaline. He lay there, waiting to hear if there would be any more sounds, but the forest was completely still. There was no wind, and the air was dead silent. He tried to think of what could have caused a massive healthy tree to fall on a perfectly calm night. Usually, trees only fall during heavy storms or high winds. He was sitting there in the dark, waiting for his heart rate to slow down when it happened again. Only this time, it was much closer and much louder. That same violent, splintering crack echoed through the trees, followed by a deafening crash of branches, and a massive thud that seemed to rattle the very frame of his tent. But this second tree had fallen in a completely different direction. The first tree had fallen somewhere to his south. This second one had collapsed to his northwest. He was now actually terrified. Two massive trees falling on the same night in two different parts of the forest with absolutely no wind. It was physically impossible. As he sat there, trying to make sense of the situation, he heard a new sound that made his blood run completely cold. It was a low, continuous rumbling sound. It was a cross between a deep, guttural groan and an animalistic growl. It sounded like a massive creature clearing its throat. But the sound went on and on without a single pause for air. He had spent his entire life in the outdoors. He knew the sounds of bears, elk, bobcats, and wolves. This sound was none of those. It was completely foreign, filled with a strange, dark power that felt almost deliberate, as if whatever was making the noise wanted him to hear it. The sound went on for a full minute, vibrating through the quiet air, before slowly fading away into the distance. He did not hesitate. He reached out in the dark, grabbed his bolt-action rifle, and worked the bolt as quietly as he could, chambering a heavy .308 round. He aimed the barrel of the rifle directly at the zippered flap of his tent, his finger resting gently on the trigger guard. He sat in that exact position for the next several hours, paralyzed with fear, listening to the silence of the night. He did not sleep a single wink. As soon as the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the trees, he scrambled out of his tent. He did not bother making breakfast or packing his gear neatly. He just shoved everything into his backpack as fast as his shaking hands could manage. But before he left, he knew he had to see the second tree. He needed to confirm that he had not suffered some kind of sleep-deprived hallucination. With his rifle held ready in his hands, he walked cautiously in the direction of the second crash. Within 10 minutes, he found it. It was a massive, old-growth oak tree, its trunk lying at a sharp angle across a shallow slope. The ground around it was littered with shattered branches and torn leaves. It was real. He walked up to the stump of the tree, which stood about 3 feet off the ground, and inspected the break point. What he saw made him feel physically sick. The break was not clean, nor was it the kind of jagged, splintered fracture you see when a tree is brought down by high winds or root rot. The wood where the trunk had separated looked like it had been violently torn apart. There were long, irregular grooves carved deep into the pale wood of the stump, some of them up to an inch deep. It looked as if the wood had been clawed, gouged, and chewed by something with unimaginable strength. He looked closer and saw that the thick bark around the base of the stump had been peeled away in long, vertical strips. The exposed wood underneath was covered in those same deep, horrific gouges. This was not the work of a beaver, a woodpecker, or a bear. No animal he knew of possessed the physical power to chew and claw through a 3-foot-wide solid oak trunk until it collapsed. A wave of pure, primal panic washed over him. He knew he was in extreme danger. He turned away from the stump, preparing to run back to his camp and get his pack. But as he turned, his eyes caught on something sitting on a pile of broken branches near the fallen canopy. There was a small cluster of items sitting neatly on a log. He stepped closer, his chest tightening. It was a blue bandana and a metal carabiner. He immediately dropped to his knees, opened his backpack, and began tearing through his gear. The blue bandana and the carabiner were missing from his pack. Someone, or something, had come into his campsite while he was asleep. They had opened his backpack, rummaged through his personal belongings, taken those 2 items, and placed them neatly near the tree they had just destroyed. They had been right next to him. They had watched him sleep, and he had not heard a single thing. He did not think. He did not plan. He just grabbed his heavy pack, held his rifle tightly in both hands, and began to run. He ran through the dense woods, pushing through branches and briars, not caring about the scratches on his face or the exhaustion in his legs. He felt an overwhelming sensation of being watched, as if something was moving effortlessly through the trees right alongside him, tracking his every move. The hike back, which should have taken him an entire day, was completed in a matter of hours. He pushed his body to its absolute limit, driven by pure survival instinct. He finally burst out of the tree line and saw his car parked safely at the trailhead. He scrambled inside, locked the doors, and started the engine, his hands shaking so violently that he could barely turn the key. He drove away from that forest as fast as his car would go. As soon as he reached a town with cell service, he called the local sheriff's department. He told them he had been stalked and that his gear had been stolen by someone in the woods. But he could tell from the deputy's voice that they did not take him seriously. They probably thought he was just another paranoid city dweller who got spooked by a bear. He was deeply traumatized by the experience. It took him months to feel safe again, even in his own home. The mystery of what happened in the Daniel Boone National Forest remains unsolved. He still has no explanation for the silent campfire, the falling trees, the gouged wood, or how his belongings were stolen from his pack without him waking up. He still goes camping today, but he never goes alone, and he never goes into the woods without his rifle. These 3 stories serve as a chilling reminder of what can happen when we venture too far from the safety of the modern world. The deep woods are beautiful, but they are also home to secrets that we may never truly understand. Sometimes, the peace and quiet we search for can turn into a silence that is absolutely terrifying. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Our first story begins 5 years ago with a young woman named Jen. Jen was 23 at the time, and like many people her age, she decided to try her luck with online dating. She had downloaded Tinder and had been matching with a few different guys in her local area. One evening, Jen told her younger siblings, including her sister Maria, that she had set up a first date. She was going to meet a guy at a neighborhood bar just a few blocks down from their family house. It was supposed to be a low-pressure, easy first meeting. Jen got dressed up, said goodbye to her siblings, and walked out the door. When she arrived at the bar, it was moderately busy. She found an open bar stool, sat down, and pulled out her phone to text her date. She let him know exactly where she was sitting so he could find her easily. Within less than a minute, a man walked over and sat down on the bar stool right next to her. But this was not the young guy from the Tinder photos. This man was significantly older than Jen. To make matters worse, she immediately noticed a strong, bad body odor coming from him. When he spoke to her, his breath was just as bad, and she couldn't help but notice he had a very crooked front tooth. The man smiled and offered to buy her a drink. Jen immediately felt uncomfortable. She politely said no thank you, explaining that she was already waiting to meet someone. But the man did not get the hint. He did not get up. He sat there and insisted, saying he would buy her a drink to keep her company in the meantime before her date arrived. Jen felt her stomach drop. She looked him in the eye and asked him to please leave her alone. Finally, the man got up from the stool. Jen watched him walk away out of the corner of her eye, subtly. She saw him walk over to a nearby booth and sit down. Feeling uneasy, Jen took out her phone and texted her date. She told him what had just happened and asked him to please hurry up. She waited for a reply, but there was nothing. A few minutes went by. Jen texted again, asking where he was. This time, a response came through. The text said that he was running late, and that she should just get a drink or two without him. Jen found this highly unusual. It was a strange text for a guy to send to a girl he was meeting for the very first time. And then, things got much worse. The older man from before stood up from his booth, walked back over to the bar and sat right back down next to Jen. He asked her where her date was. He acted highly upset on her behalf, pointing out that she was still sitting all by herself. Jen was terrified, but tried to keep her composure. She gave him short, one-word answers, hoping he would get bored, but he kept talking. Finally, Jen had enough. She firmly asked him to leave her alone once again. She grabbed her phone and typed out a final text to her date, saying she was sorry, but she was going to leave. Just as she hit the send button, she heard a sound. Right next to her on the bar counter, the older man had left his cell phone. The moment she sent her text, his phone vibrated with an incoming message. Jen froze. She looked at her phone, then looked at his phone, and immediately put 2 and 2 together. The man she had been texting was the creepy older man sitting right next to her. He had created a fake Tinder profile to lure her to the bar. Jen knew she had to get out of there immediately. She didn't want to cause a scene because she was terrified of what he might do. So she calmly stood up, looked at him, and said she had to use the restroom. She walked into the bathroom, locked the door, and immediately called her sister Maria. Jen was crying, panicking, and asking what she should do. Maria, along with their brother who was listening in on the call, told her to stay calm, walk straight out of the bar, get into her car, and drive home immediately. Jen took a deep breath, gathered her courage, and walked out of the bathroom. To her immense relief, the man was no longer anywhere to be seen in the bar. She didn't look around. She went straight out the exit, got into her car, and started her engine. The drive home took only about 2 minutes. But as she pulled into her driveway, she looked in her rearview mirror. Another car was pulling up across the street. It stopped one house over, just idling in the dark. Jen bolted out of her car, ran to the front door, unlocked it, and rushed inside. Inside the house, Maria and her brother were waiting. They ran to greet Jen and asked her what had happened. Jen, still shaking, ran to the front window and gently parted the blinds to peek outside. She told them she thought a car had followed her home. But when all 3 siblings looked through the window, the street was completely empty. The car was gone. Jen sat down and explained the whole unsettling encounter at the bar. Maria did her best to comfort her, while her brother tried to reassure her, telling her that if that man ever showed his face near their house, he would handle it. Eventually, the adrenaline faded, and they all decided to head to their respective bedrooms. Her brother went to his room and played video games to unwind. But just a little while later, the quiet house was shattered by a horrible sound. It was the sound of both of his sisters screaming at the top of their lungs from Jen's bedroom. What had happened was that Jen was lying in her bed, scrolling on her phone, trying to calm down, when she received a text message from the same number. The text said that he was sorry, and claimed he didn't see her texts until he had already gotten to the bar. Jen didn't reply. Then a second text arrived. It said that he was going to meet her at her house and ask which window belonged to her. Terrified, Jen had immediately called Maria into her room to show her the messages. As they stood there in the dark whispering about what to do, they heard a scraping sound. Jen's bedroom window slowly slid open. A hand began pushing its way through the roller shade, trying to force access into the bedroom. That was when both girls screamed. Down the hall, their brother threw his headset off and ran toward the noise. Upstairs, their parents woke up and came rushing down the stairs. By the time they all reached Jen's bedroom, the intruder had realized he was outnumbered. He gave up and fled back through the window. The father ran outside to chase him, but the man was already speeding away in his car. The father immediately called the police to file a report. Jen gave the responding officers the man's phone number and showed them the entire text conversation. The officers promised to trace the number, though they warned it could take a few days. After the weekend, the police contacted Jen's father and asked him to come down to the station. When he arrived, the detectives had bad news. They explained that the phone number was a fake burner number created through a mobile application. They told him there was no way to trace the actual physical device or the person using the app. The family asked them to keep trying, but weeks turned into months, and they never heard from the police again. Slowly, the family tried to move on, but they were left with a haunting realization of how close Jen had come to a true nightmare. Our second story shows how quickly a simple online match can turn into a dangerous obsession. A young man who had recently moved to a new town decided to download Hinge to meet people. He matched with Kate, who was 30, while he was 23. He didn't mind the 7-year age gap, so he decided to suggest they meet up for dinner at a small, quiet restaurant in town. He arrived early on the night of the date and waited in his car. Soon, he received a message from her, saying she was having a lot of trouble finding the restaurant. She asked him if he could share his live location with her through his phone so she could navigate her way there. He thought nothing of it and turned on his location sharing. A few minutes later, an old beat-up Honda pulled into the parking lot. The narrator watched as Kate stepped out of the vehicle. Right away, he felt a wave of disappointment. When he got out of his car, he tried to greet her with a polite hug, but Kate immediately pulled back and told him that she was not a hugger. Embarrassed, he put his arms back down, thinking to himself that this was a terrible start to the date. Inside the restaurant, he got a proper look at her. He realized she looked completely different from her profile pictures. It was definitely her, but it was obvious her photos had been heavily edited and filtered to make her look much younger and different. In reality, she looked significantly older than 30. Despite his disappointment, he decided to be polite and sit through the dinner, but the red flags only kept piling up. When the waitress came to take their drink orders, Kate's behavior became incredibly awkward. Her voice suddenly spiked in volume and intensity, and she began to stutter. She rudely snapped at the waitress, demanding only tap water. When the narrator offered to order a bottle of wine for them to share, she flatly turned him down. Throughout the entire dinner, the conversation was incredibly strained. The narrator spent most of the time staring at his plate, counting down the minutes until he could leave. When the bill finally arrived, he waited for a moment to see if Kate would offer to split it, especially since he knew he would never see her again. But she just sat there silently. He paid the bill, they grabbed their coats, and they walked out to the parking lot. He told her he had a nice time, just to be polite, but Kate didn't even say goodbye. She just turned around and walked back to her beat-up car. Relief washed over him as he drove back to his apartment. He walked inside, took off his coat, and was just about to hang it up when his doorbell rang. He froze. He looked through the window to see who could possibly be visiting him at this hour. To his utter shock, Kate was standing on his porch. He suddenly realized he had never turned off his live location sharing on his phone. She had followed his exact movements straight to his front door. The narrator realized this woman was completely unstable. He stepped away from the door and ran into the kitchen, turning off the lights so she wouldn't see him. Just then, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Kate saying she knew he was home. He texted back, asking what she wanted and why she was at his house. She replied with a single word, ordering him to answer. He decided to ignore her, staying quiet in the dark kitchen. But then, another text arrived. It read that she could see him sitting at the table and demanded that he let her in right now. A chill ran down his spine. She could see him. He frantically looked around the dark kitchen until his eyes landed on one of the backyard windows. He had left the blinds raised just a tiny fraction of an inch at the bottom. And there, pressed against the glass in the pitch black, were Kate's eyes staring directly at him. Terrified, the narrator bolted into his bedroom, shut the door, turned off the lights, and dialed 911. He explained to the operator that a woman was trespassing on his property and stalking him. He put the call on speakerphone so he could read the increasingly erratic text messages Kate was sending him. One text read that nobody wanted her, and she was sick of it. Another text said that he was just like all the others. And then he heard the sharp, terrifying sound of breaking glass coming from the back of the house. He ran to his bedroom door, locked it, and screamed into the phone that she was breaking inside. The operator told him to stay in his room, lock himself in, and find anything he could to use as a weapon. She assured him that officers were already on their way. Outside his bedroom door, he heard footsteps approaching. The doorknob began to rattle violently. When the door wouldn't open, Kate began pounding on the wood with incredible force, screaming at him to let her in. The narrator begged the operator to tell the police to enter through the back door, since that was where she had broken the glass. Fortunately, the local police responded incredibly fast. Within minutes, 3 police cars pulled up to the house with their sirens blaring. The narrator heard the officers enter the house and confront Kate, commanding her to calm down and put her hands behind her back. When he finally felt safe enough to unlock his door, he saw 4 police officers standing in his hallway, surrounding Kate, who was already in handcuffs. She was arrested and charged with breaking and entering alongside several other offenses. The police later revealed to the narrator that her real name was actually Pamela Castillo, and she had a history of unstable behavior. The narrator had the option to sue her in civil court for the damages to his window, but after consulting with a lawyer, he realized the legal fees would cost far more than just replacing the glass himself. He did, however, secure a permanent restraining order against her, ensuring she could never come near him again. Our final story is about a 32-year-old man who was just getting back into dating after a difficult breakup. He decided to create a profile on an online dating website. He eventually matched with a 26-year-old woman named Amelia. Wanting to keep things relaxed, he offered to have her over to his house so he could cook dinner for her. He planned a menu of penne alla vodka, fresh garlic bread, and a bottle of red wine. Amelia arrived at his house around 6:30 in the evening. He welcomed her inside and invited her to sit at the kitchen table while he finished preparing the meal. But as he tried to spark up a conversation, he noticed that she was incredibly quiet and distant. He had to carry the entire conversation himself, which made him feel very self-conscious and nervous. After pouring the wine, Amelia made a very strange request. She told him that she wanted him to go find a candle so they could light it and have a proper celebratory toast. He thought it was a bit unusual, but he wanted to make her comfortable, so he agreed. He went down the hallway pantry to find a candle and a lighter. When he returned to the kitchen a moment later, he caught Amelia quickly sliding back into her seat. Her movements looked incredibly rushed and suspicious. He asked her if everything was okay. She quickly claimed that she had just stood up to rinse her hands in the sink. But the problem was, he had been standing right down the hall, and he hadn't heard the kitchen sink run at all. He decided to let it go, lit the candle, and picked up his glass of wine. But as he raised the glass, he noticed something strange. There was a faint powdery substance floating on the surface of his wine, slowly dissolving into the liquid. It had definitely not been there before he left the room. He looked across the table at Amelia. She was staring at him intently, waiting for him to drink. Realizing what she might have done, the narrator pretended to take a small sip without actually letting any liquid enter his mouth. He tried to keep talking normally, terrified of what would happen if he accused her. After they finished eating, Amelia excused herself to the bathroom. She was gone for a long time. When she finally came out, she abruptly announced that she had to leave because her dog was sick. He walked her out, said goodbye, and happily watched her drive away. He immediately went back to the kitchen, picked up his wine glass, and smelled it. It smelled like normal wine, but he wasn't taking any chances. He dumped the entire glass down the drain. He checked his house to make sure nothing had been stolen, and then tried to go to sleep. But the narrator suffered from insomnia and couldn't sleep. By 2:30 in the morning, he was still wide awake. Suddenly, a loud clattering sound echoed from his kitchen. It sounded like a drinking cup falling off the counter. Since cups don't just move on their own, his heart began to pound. A second later, his bedroom door slowly creaked open. The narrator lay perfectly still, pretending to be asleep, but he kept one eye slightly open. In the dim light, he saw a dark figure stand in his doorway for several seconds before quietly slipping back out. He waited a moment, then crept out of bed, hoping to reach the kitchen phone to call the police. As he stepped into the living room, he saw her. Amelia was standing silently in the corner of the room, right next to his wooden knife block. He took a deep breath and called out her name, telling her that if she left immediately, he would not call the cops. There was a long, chilling silence. Then, Amelia slowly placed something back onto the counter, turned around, walked out the back door, and disappeared into the night. When he went to investigate, he saw that the object she had placed on the counter was a large kitchen knife. It turned out that when she had used his bathroom earlier that evening, she had secretly unlocked his back door so she could creep back inside later that night. The narrator immediately locked the door and called the police. They processed the knife for fingerprints, which matched Amelia's criminal records. Officers arrested her at her home shortly after. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Imagine being 17 years old, sitting in your air-conditioned bedroom, and playing video games late into the night. It is early June in Chandler, Arizona, and the heat outside is completely unbearable. The desert sun during the day is like a furnace, so when the sun goes down, you finally feel some relief, but you still prefer to stay inside where it is cool. That was exactly how my life looked back when I was a teenager. I was in a heavy gaming phase, and I spent almost all of my free time playing Call of Duty. At this point in my life, I was still living with my parents, but I had the house to myself a lot. My parents traveled frequently for work, and since my older siblings had already moved out, I was the last one left at home. It was a Friday night, and school was out the next day, so I had the perfect excuse to stay up as late as I wanted. But before I could completely lose myself in the game, I had some responsibilities to take care of. I had just submitted a school paper that was due that night, which was a huge relief. With that out of the way, I had to do some grocery shopping on my mother's orders. Since my parents were going to be gone for a while, they left me some cash to buy food. My dad was always very strict about money, so he made me show him the receipts for everything I bought to make sure I was not just pocketing the cash. My mom had texted me a long shopping list, so I hopped into my old Toyota Camry, which was my very first car, and drove over to the local Whole Foods. The shopping trip itself was pretty ordinary and took about an hour. But while I was standing in the checkout line, things started to get a bit weird. There was a guy standing directly behind me in line who just would not stop talking to me. He made a comment about one of the items I was buying, and from there, he just kept going. Even as I was bagging my groceries, he kept trying to spark a conversation. What felt really off was that he was not paying attention to anyone else in the store, just me. I did not want to be rude, so I kept my answers short and polite. When I was finally done, I told him to have a good one, and I walked out to my car. I packed the groceries into the trunk of my Camry and drove back home, glad to be away from that strange encounter. By the time I got back home, it was completely dark outside. I put the groceries away and went straight up to my room to get on my computer. I booted up Call of Duty Black Ops and texted my friend Johnny to tell him to get online. I put on my noise-canceling Logitech headset, which did an amazing job of blocking out any background noise in the house. Johnny joined my lobby, and we started playing Team Deathmatch. We were both determined to play all night and rank up as much as we could. After about 2 hours of intense gaming, my stomach started growling, and I decided to take a break to make some dinner. I told Johnny I would be back on in about an hour, and he said he was going to take a break as well. Our kitchen is downstairs while my bedroom is upstairs. I went down to the kitchen and boiled some water to make a simple plate of pasta. As I was sitting at the kitchen island eating my food, the house was incredibly quiet. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a distinct thump coming from upstairs. It was a heavy, dull sound. I froze for a second, trying to figure out what it was. Did it sound like a footstep? I was not entirely sure. It could have been the house settling, or maybe something falling over, but deep down, a strange feeling started to creep over me. Even though our neighborhood was very safe, and we never worried about crime, I decided to walk over to the front door and lock it. I had a bad habit of leaving the front door unlocked when I was home alone, because I never took the idea of a break-in seriously. It was just something you saw on the local news, not something that happened to you. After locking the door, I walked up the stairs to investigate the sound. I did not really expect to find anyone, but the silence of the house was starting to make me nervous. As I reached the top of the stairs, I called out my brother Tristan's name into the dark hallway. I knew Tristan was not supposed to be home, but I think I just wanted to hear a familiar voice to calm my nerves. No one answered. The hallway was completely empty. I shook my head, thinking I was just being paranoid, and went back into my bedroom. I sat down at my desk, put my headset back on, and texted Johnny that I was back online. A few minutes later, Johnny joined the lobby, and we jumped right back into another game of Team Deathmatch. A couple of games in, I felt a strange sensation. You know that feeling when you feel like you are being watched? I suddenly looked to my left, toward the doorway of my bedroom. I always kept my door open when I was home alone, mostly because my mom told me it kept the air flowing better. The hallway outside my room was completely dark, except for a tiny nightlight plugged into an outlet down the hall. My bedroom, on the other hand, was glowing blue from the LED strip lights I had mounted on my walls. Some of that blue light spilled into the hallway, but the space between the door and the wall was pitch black. I could not see anything through the crack, so I just ignored it and turned back to my monitor. After we finished the next match, Johnny said he had to go run to the bathroom, so he walked away from his headset. While I was waiting in the lobby, I picked up my phone to check my messages. After a moment, I looked back toward the hallway, and my heart stopped. Something was different. The view through the crack of the door was no longer pitch black. I could actually see the faint light of the hallway nightlight through it. And then, the terrifying realization hit me like a physical blow. The only reason the crack had been completely black earlier was because someone had been standing right there, blocking the light. Someone had been standing in the dark, staring through the crack of my door, watching me play video games. Instinct took over. I spun my gaming chair around to face my bed, which was directly behind me, and there, sitting on my bed, was a man. He had a freakishly upright posture, sitting perfectly straight with his hands resting flat on his thighs. He was staring directly at me, and his face was twisted into a bizarre, unnatural smile. I was so terrified that my body went into pure survival mode. I jumped completely out of my chair, landing on top of my desk, and scrambled backward. In my panic, I knocked over my computer monitor, my keyboard, and almost everything else on my desk. I screamed at the top of my lungs, asking him what he wanted. The man did not move. Instead, his smile grew even wider, showing his teeth in a way that looked like he was silently laughing at my terror. Realizing I was trapped in the corner of my room, I scrambled off the desk and bolted out of the door into the hallway. I ran about halfway down the hall, then stopped and looked back to see if he was following me. In the dim blue light spilling from my room, I heard the squeak of my bed springs as the man stood up. Then he slowly and calmly walked out of my bedroom and stopped right in the doorway. He just stood there, looking at me. I screamed at him again, demanding to know what he wanted. The man finally spoke. His voice was stuttered, slow, and completely devoid of any normal emotion. He looked at me and asked if he could play too. The sheer creepiness of his voice sent shivers down my spine. I yelled back, asking him how he had gotten into my house. He slowly raised his hand, took a few steps forward, and pointed down the stairs. He did not say another word, but the gesture made it clear. He had walked right through the front door before I went down to lock it. He had been hiding upstairs the entire time I was eating my dinner. I knew I had to get out of there. My cell phone was still in my bedroom, so I ran down the stairs as fast as I could to reach the landline phone in the kitchen. I grabbed the receiver and then reached into the knife block, pulling out a large kitchen knife. I pointed the knife toward the stairs and screamed that I was calling the police and that he had to leave immediately. I heard slow, heavy footsteps coming down the stairs. A moment later, the man walked past the kitchen. He did not run. He just looked at me with that same blank expression, turned, and walked out the front door. As soon as I heard the front door click, I ran over, slammed it shut, and locked it. I stood there, shaking violently, clutching the kitchen knife in one hand and the phone in the other. I felt a deep sense of shame for being so careless about leaving the door unlocked. After a few minutes of trying to calm my racing heart, I called my parents. My mom was incredibly worried at first, but then she became absolutely furious at how dangerous the situation was. She put my dad on the phone, and he told me to go through every room in the house to make sure nothing had been stolen and that the man was truly gone. I searched the entire house, and to my surprise, everything was exactly where it belonged. The man had not come to steal anything. He had simply come to watch me. To this day, the image of that man sitting on my bed in the dark hallway is something I will never forget. And that brings us to our second story, which is one that I am definitely not proud of. This happened back when I was in middle school, around 2010, when I was 13 years old. Like a lot of 13-year-old boys, I had absolutely no idea how to talk to girls. I was not a shy kid in general. I had plenty of friends, and I did normal 8th grade things. But when it came to girls, I was completely lost. Some of my friends at the time started claiming they had already kissed girls, or gone even further, and I was starting to feel a lot of pressure to keep up. But my voice was still a bit high and prepubescent, and the idea of approaching a girl at school made my stomach turn. Instead of dealing with my anxiety in the real world, I turned to video games. I was a massive gamer back then, and my favorite computer game was a massive multiplayer online role-playing game called GoNu. In GoNu, you would level up by traveling around the fantasy world, killing monsters, and gathering loot. The community was incredibly active, and I spent hours every single day playing it. Eventually, I joined a guild, which was basically an online club for players to team up. It was through this guild that I met a player whose username was Medusa. Medusa was a much higher level than me, and for some reason she took an interest in helping me out. Whenever I logged into the game, she would immediately send me a message, and we would join a party together to share experience points. But as the weeks went on, we stopped focusing so much on the game and started chatting for hours about our personal lives. She told me her real name was Teresa, and she claimed to be 15 years old. I felt an incredibly strong connection with her, which was strange because I had never heard her voice or seen her face. She knew everything about me, including my age, my hometown, and personal details about my family. It felt like having a high-tech pen pal, and the best part was that she lived in New York State, only about an hour away from me. After about a month of talking, we started discussing the idea of meeting up in person. Since I did not have a cell phone at the time, I used an iPod Touch with a free texting application that allowed me to send messages to mobile numbers. Through that app, I decided to send her a picture of myself. It was a classic, cringy 8th grade selfie where I was trying way too hard to look cool. She replied that she thought I was cute, and then she sent a picture back of herself. The girl in the photo was very attractive and looked to be about 15. At this point, our messages became much more flirtatious. But since we were both minors, neither of us could drive an hour to see the other. That was when Teresa told me she had a solution. She claimed her older sister had friends who lived in my town, and that she could easily get a ride to come see me. I was absolutely thrilled. I wanted to make sure we could be alone. So I waited for a weekend when my parents were planning to go to the Hamptons. They were going to be gone for the entire weekend, leaving only me and my 18-year-old brother at home. I practically begged my brother to go hang out with his friends on Saturday night so I could have the house to myself. He agreed, and I gave Teresa my address, telling her to come over whenever she wanted that Saturday. She messaged me saying she would be arriving a bit late, closer to nighttime. I was so incredibly nervous all day that I could not even focus on playing video games. I spent hours cleaning my bedroom, folding my clothes, spraying cologne, and literally rehearsing what I was going to say when she walked through the door. Finally, late that evening, my iPod buzzed. It was a message from Teresa saying she had arrived and was outside. I sprang up from my bed and ran down the stairs to the front door. I looked through the peephole, expecting to see a pretty 15-year-old girl standing on my porch. But there was no one there. I checked my phone and another message popped up. It said that I should come out to the front porch. I unlocked the door, stepped outside, and looked around. The street was completely dark and quiet. There were no cars parked nearby and no one was in sight. I went back inside, locked the door, and messaged her that I could not see her. She replied, saying she must have the wrong house, and asked for a minute to find the right one. I sat on the living room couch, my heart pounding with nervous energy, staring at my iPod screen. After a few agonizing minutes, she messaged me again. She said she was definitely there and told me to come outside. I was starting to feel a bit uneasy, so I replied and told her to ring the doorbell so I would know she was at the correct house. A second later, the doorbell rang. My stomach did a flip. I walked over to the front door, stood on my tiptoes, and looked through the peephole. The porch was empty. I called out Teresa's name through the solid wooden door. As I kept my eye glued to the peephole, a hand suddenly reached out from the side of the porch and knocked loudly on the door. I called out her name again, my voice shaking. And then, a figure stepped directly into the center of the peephole. It was not a 15-year-old girl. It was a short, bald, creepy-looking grown man. He stared directly at the door and spoke. He said, "Hey Joey, it is Medusa from Gonu. I want to talk." A wave of pure horror and disgust washed over me. I stumbled backward, putting my hands over my mouth to keep from screaming. The person I had been sharing my deepest secrets with, the person I had been flirting with for weeks, was a grown man who had lured me into giving him my home address. I ran to my room and tried to call my older brother, but his phone went straight to voicemail. The doorbell downstairs kept ringing over and over, followed by heavy knocking on the door. I locked myself in my bedroom, holding the house phone in my hand, desperately trying to decide if I should call my parents. I was so embarrassed and terrified of what they would say. My bedroom was the only room in the house with the lights turned on, and it had a large window that overlooked the side yard of our corner house. I quickly turned off my desk lamp, walked over to the window, and parted the blinds by just a fraction of an inch. To my horror, the bald man was standing right there in the side yard, trying to peer through the glass. When he saw the blinds move, he began to knock on the window pane. Through the closed glass, I could hear his muffled voice telling me how much of a connection we had, and how we could at least just be friends. I stood frozen in the dark, refusing to answer. I dialed my brother's number again, and this time he finally picked up. I began to cry, telling him to come home immediately, because the girl from the game was actually a grown man, and he was currently outside my window trying to get in. My brother was a big guy, and he immediately realized how dangerous the situation was. He told me he was on his way back with 3 of his friends, and that I needed to stay on the line. I ran up to my parents' bedroom on the 2nd floor and hid in their closet, clutching the phone. Meanwhile, the texting app on my iPod was blowing up with messages from the man, trying to explain why he had to lie about his identity. About 10 minutes later, I heard the sound of car doors slamming outside. My brother and his friends had arrived. I slowly walked downstairs and opened the front door. My brother and his 3 friends had surrounded the short, bald man in the driveway. They were shouting at him, calling him a sick freak, and pushing him backward. The man's defense was absolutely bizarre. He looked at them and claimed that he was only doing this because he was concerned for my well-being. He said he wanted to teach me a lesson about the dangers of inviting strangers from the internet over to my house. I yelled out from the porch, asking him why he had been knocking on my window, telling me we had a connection if this was just a lesson. The man had no answer for that. As my brother and his friends began to get physical, pushing him harder, the man realized he was vastly outnumbered. He turned and quickly walked back to his car. As he backed out of the driveway, my brother kicked his tail light, shattering the plastic, and one of his friends threw a heavy rock directly at his passenger side window. The man sped off into the night, and we never saw him again. It was a deeply humiliating and disturbing experience, but I will always be grateful to my brother and his friends for saving me from what could have been a horrific tragedy. And that brings us to our third and final story, which happened just last year, in May of 2021. To give you some context, I had just officially decided to quit playing Fortnite. The game had gotten a bit stale for me, and my friend Brandon suggested that I download Apex Legends so we could play together instead. I already had the game installed on my console from a long time ago, so I just had to wait for a massive update to finish downloading. Once it was done, I logged on and realized very quickly how bad I was at the game. Since I had not played since the game first launched, my statistics were terrible, and I only had access to the basic starting characters, Pathfinder and Bloodhound. Another important detail to keep in mind is that I owned a pair of extremely high-quality, noise-canceling gaming headphones. When I had them on with the volume turned up, I literally could not hear a single thing happening in the physical world around me. It was a weekend night, and I was home alone, because my parents were out celebrating their wedding anniversary with a late-night dinner, and my brother was staying over at a friend's house. Brandon and I were in the middle of a match when he suddenly gasped. He told me that he had just received a really bizarre text message from a completely random, unknown phone number. I asked him what the text said, and I will never forget the chilling tone in his voice when he read it out loud. The text said, "Look out the window." At first, I laughed it off and told Brandon not to look out his window because it was probably just a prank. But Brandon replied, "No, the text says to tell Luke to look out his window." A cold spike of fear went through me. I turned my head to the left and then to the right. My gaming room was a converted sunroom on the first floor of the house, and it had 5 large windows surrounding the space. In a sudden panic, I did not even know which window to look through. I slowly stood up and scanned each pane of glass. And then, in the window furthest from my desk, the one that was mostly hidden by the shadow of the couch, I saw it. There was a man standing directly outside the glass. His back was turned to me, and he was staring out toward the dark yard. I was completely frozen, not knowing what to do. I sat back down and put my headphones back on, trying to convince myself that maybe he was just a neighbor or someone lost. But then Brandon spoke up again, his voice trembling. He said, "Luke, I am not messing with you. The guy just texted me a photo of you looking through the window. He said you look completely clueless." Before I could even process what Brandon was saying, my headphones went completely silent. There was a brief static sound, and then the Xbox notification sound chimed. Brandon had left the party. This was incredibly out of character for him, because he never left a game without saying goodbye or telling me he was going to sleep. I opened the menu and saw that his profile still showed him as active in the match. I was thoroughly confused. A few seconds later, a party invitation popped up on my screen. It was from Brandon's account, so I accepted it immediately, planning to ask him what was going on. But when I joined, the voice that came through my headset was not Brandon's. It was a deep, raspy, unfamiliar voice of a fully grown man. He spoke slowly, and his words made my blood run cold. He said, "Come outside right now, or I am coming in." I ripped the headset off my ears and spun around to look at the window where the man had been standing. He had turned around. He was now facing the glass, and his face was pressed flat against it. He looked completely out of his mind. His face was a dark, angry red, and he was violently slamming his fists against the window pane. What was even more horrifying was that his hands were covered in deep cuts. and blood was gushing down his wrists, smearing all over the glass with every strike. The heavy glass was starting to crack under the force of his blows. I scrambled to find my cell phone on the desk, but when the screen lit up, my heart sank. The battery was at exactly 1%. I knew the phone would die the second I made a call. I held the phone to my mouth, desperate to try and get a message out. I frantically whispered into the receiver, telling the emergency operator that a bleeding, red-faced man was trying to smash his way into my house. Just as I said those words, the man let out a blood-curdling scream and threw his entire body weight against the window. I realized with a shock that our windows had heavy metal screens on the outside. But this man did not care. He had literally torn through the screen with his bare, bloodied hands. With a loud crash, a large shard of glass shattered inward, falling onto the carpet. A hole had opened up, large enough for him to reach his arm through. I screamed at him, telling him to get the hell away from my house because the police were already on their way. But my words did not stop him. Another massive shard of glass broke away, and the hole was now large enough for a person to crawl through. He began to hoist himself up over the windowsill. Knowing I could not defend myself empty-handed, I bolted out of the room and ran into the kitchen. I grabbed the largest, sharpest knife from the block on the counter. Then, I grabbed the wireless landline phone that was charging on the kitchen wall. I ran up the stairs to the second floor as fast as my legs could carry me. I dialed 911 on the landline and screamed my address to the operator, telling them that an intruder had just shattered my window and was inside my home. The only doors with locks on the second floor of our house were the bathrooms. I had to think fast. I ran into my parents' bedroom, walked into the master bathroom attached to it, and locked the heavy door behind me. But before I locked it, I made a tactical decision. I left the main bedroom door wide open. The bathroom door was tucked away in a corner of the bedroom, making it invisible to anyone standing in the hallway. I hoped that if the man came upstairs, he would see the open bedroom door, assume the room was empty, and keep moving past it. As I stood in the dark bathroom, clutching the kitchen knife, I heard the heavy, wet footsteps of the intruder coming up the wooden stairs. My heart was pounding so hard against my ribs that I was terrified he would hear it. I slowly and quietly opened one of the bathroom drawers, looking for another potential weapon or something to block the door. But the small wooden drawer made a slight creaking sound. The footsteps stopped, and then I heard the heavy stomping run of the man heading directly into my parents' bedroom. He had heard the noise. I braced myself, holding the knife up, prepared to fight for my life. But just as he reached the bedroom, the loud wailing sound of police sirens echoed from the street outside. The police in our town were incredibly fast, and they had arrived in record time. Through the bathroom door, I heard the man freeze. Realizing his time was up, he turned and sprinted back down the stairs, trying to escape through the shattered window. But he was far too late. The front yard was already flooded with red and blue lights. I waited a moment, then unlocked the bathroom door and ran downstairs. I opened the front door and saw several police officers tackling the bleeding man to the ground in our front yard. They slapped handcuffs onto his blood-covered wrists and loaded him into the back of a patrol car. It was only later, during the police investigation, that the full, bizarre truth came to light. It turned out that about 2 hours before this nightmare began, I had been playing Apex Legends and had gotten into a heated match. I had ended up killing this specific player in the game, and afterward, I had sent him some pretty toxic trash talk messages, which is unfortunately common in competitive gaming. Somehow, this man was a highly skilled hacker. He had used my gamer tag to track down my IP address, which led him straight to my home address. He had also managed to find my friend Brandon's phone number through online databases, using it to send those terrifying text messages while he stood outside my house. The realization that someone was willing to commit a violent home invasion and potentially murder me in real life over a video game loss was absolutely terrifying. The man was eventually convicted of aggravated burglary and sentenced to a lengthy prison term. The police department actually kept a few patrol cars parked outside my house for the next several nights to make sure I felt safe, but the psychological damage was already done. It took me months to sleep with the lights off, and I have never played competitive online video games the same way since. It is a terrifying reminder of how thin the line really is between our digital lives and the physical dangers that lurk just outside our windows. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. It was the sweltering summer of 2012, and a 15-year-old teenager was facing a highly frustrating problem. Because he had a late birthday, he was still 15 while almost all of his close friends had already celebrated their 16th birthdays. This minor age difference meant that while all of his friends were out easily securing official summer jobs at local grocery stores and fast food joints, no traditional business would even consider hiring him. He was desperate to earn some spending money of his own, so he decided to take matters into his own hands and look for alternative ways to make cash. He began browsing through Craigslist, specifically searching for off-the-books odd jobs that did not require a formal work permit. It did not take very long before he found an ad that seemed absolutely perfect for what he was looking for. The title of the listing read, "Looking for house cleaning services paying $10 an hour." The advertisement was very simple and clean, featuring just 2 photographs. One showed the exterior of a nice, typical, middle-class suburban house, and the other showed a tidy living room interior. The listing mentioned that the homeowner lived in the next town over, and the only listed method of contact was through a private email address. Without hesitating, the teenager sent an email to the poster, explaining that he was only 15 years old, but was highly motivated, responsible, and more than willing to clean the house for the advertised rate of $10 an hour. To his utter surprise, the homeowner responded in less than 10 minutes. The man laid out his daily work schedule and explained exactly when he would need the teenager to be available. The teenager replied that the schedule worked perfectly for him, but then the man asked a very practical question. He wanted to know if the teenager had a reliable means of transportation to get to and from the house every day. At that exact moment, the teenager realized he had made a major oversight. He had not even considered how he would travel to the next town, and he knew his mother would not be able to drive him back and forth every day because of her own busy work schedule. But before he could even reply with his worries, the man offered an incredibly generous solution. He said that he actually worked very close to the teenager's neighborhood, so coming over to give him a lift to and from the house every single day would not be a problem at all. It seemed like an incredibly lucky break. Without even asking his mother for permission first, the teenager eagerly agreed to the arrangement. The man asked for his home address, and the teenager sent it over. The man said he would be at his house at exactly 8:30 on Monday morning to pick him up. Come Monday morning, the teenager walked outside and waited by the curb. Right on time, a sleek black 2005 Nissan Maxima pulled up to the house. The man driving the car had a thick, dark beard and was wearing a New York Mets baseball cap. He did not look like he was dressed to go to a professional office job, but the teenager did not think much of it at the time. The man introduced himself as James. The car ride over to the house was relatively quiet but pleasant. Once they arrived at the suburban home, James unlocked the front door, handed the teenager the house key, and told him to just straighten things up, fold some laundry, and keep the place tidy. Then, James got back into his car and drove off in a major hurry. The teenager found it a bit unusual that a grown man would trust a 15-year-old stranger completely alone in his house. But he brushed the thought aside and got to work. The house itself was actually not very messy at all. All the teenager had to do was fold a few piles of clean clothes, wash some dishes in the sink, and use a small hand vacuum to tidy up some of the carpets. However, there was one major issue that made the work environment incredibly difficult. The house was extremely hot. It felt significantly warmer inside the house than it did outside in the midsummer sun. The teenager looked around and noticed that every single window in the house seemed to be completely sealed shut. He wanted to turn on the air conditioning system, but he was too polite to touch the thermostat without getting permission first. He endured the suffocating heat for 6 long hours until James finally returned at the end of the day. James handed him $60 in cash, drove him back home, and was incredibly polite the entire time. The teenager felt like he had truly lucked out. This routine went on smoothly for a good 2 weeks. His mother was perfectly fine with the arrangement because James was highly reliable, extremely polite, and always paid the teenager exactly what was promised. But then, one Friday night, the comfortable routine was shattered. The teenager woke up in the dead of night feeling intensely thirsty. He quietly got out of bed to go to the kitchen to grab a glass of water. As he walked past his bedroom window, something caught his eye. He looked outside into the pitch-black yard, and his blood ran cold. There was a dark silhouette of a person, standing directly outside in the grass, staring intently through the glass right into his bedroom. The teenager let out a terrified scream. His parents came running into his room to see what was wrong, but by the time they turned on the lights and looked outside, the mysterious intruder had already vanished into the darkness. The next time the teenager went to work, the weather outside was absolutely brutal, reaching at least 100 degrees. Inside the sealed house, the heat was completely unbearable. The teenager finally worked up the courage to ask James if he could please turn on the air conditioning. James looked at him with a straight face and said that the system was broken, but then, James said something that made the teenager feel incredibly uncomfortable. He told the teenager that if he got too hot while working, he should just take off all of his clothes. The teenager laughed nervously, desperately hoping the man was just making a highly inappropriate joke. But James did not laugh. He was completely serious. A heavy wave of dread washed over the teenager. James dropped him off at the house and drove away. Inside, the temperature had soared to at least 105 degrees. The heat was so intense that the teenager had to work completely shirtless, and he had to constantly step out onto the back porch just to breathe the slightly cooler outside air. He barely managed to drag himself through the rest of the day. The very next day, during the car ride to the house, James delivered some highly unwelcome news. He told the teenager that he actually had the day off from work and would be staying at the house to help him clean. The teenager was not happy to hear this at all. He much preferred being left alone, especially after the creepy comment from the day before. Throughout the day, the teenager noticed a deeply unsettling pattern. No matter which room he went into to clean, James would slowly follow him, lingering in the doorway and watching his every move. Feeling increasingly suffocated and anxious, the teenager decided he needed to escape the man's gaze for a moment. He ran upstairs to the bathroom, making sure James was not following close behind him. He stepped inside, closed the door, and locked it securely. But as he stood in the bathroom, his eyes drifted up to the corner of the ceiling. He noticed a tiny, dark object pointing directly down from the wall. He got closer and was absolutely horrified to realize it was a miniature hidden camera, positioned to capture the entire room. He began scanning the rest of the bathroom in a panic, and sure enough, he spotted a second hidden camera tucked away in the bottom corner near the floor. Terrified, he began searching the entire bathroom to see what else might be hidden. He opened the wooden cabinet underneath the sink, hoping to find some answers, but what he discovered was infinitely worse than he could have ever imagined. Sitting in the dark cabinet were two massive stacks of VHS tapes. Each individual tape had a yellow sticky note attached to it with a handwritten name. The teenager looked at the tape sitting directly on top of the stack, and his heart completely stopped. The sticky note had his own name written on it in bold letters. A wave of intense nausea hit him. He realized he was in extreme danger and had to find a way to get out of that house and get home safely. Just then, there was a loud, firm knock on the bathroom door. It was James, asking if he was doing all right in there. The teenager tried his absolute best to keep his voice from shaking, replying that he was suddenly feeling very sick and asking if James could please drive him home right away. James paused for a moment before agreeing, saying that he actually had to run some errands anyway. The teenager stepped out of the bathroom, and James told him to wait by the front door while he quickly used the restroom himself. Once they got into the car, the atmosphere was completely different. For the first half of the ride, James did not say a single word. He just stared straight ahead at the road with a cold, blank expression. The teenager looked out the window and quickly realized they were not taking the usual route. In fact, they were driving in the complete opposite direction of his neighborhood. Terrified, the teenager nervously asked where they were going. James slowly turned his head, looked him dead in the eye, and asked what he had been doing in the bathroom. The teenager panicked and remained completely silent. James asked again, his voice dropping into a deep, aggressive growl. Fortunately, They came to a sudden halt at a red traffic light. Seizing his only chance at survival, the teenager unlocked the passenger door, threw it open, and sprinted out of the car into the busy street. He ran as fast as he could, dodging behind buildings until he was completely out of sight. He pulled out his phone, called his mother while sobbing hysterically, and begged her to come pick him up. His mother rushed to his location and immediately contacted the police. The authorities wasted no time and executed a search warrant on James's house. Beneath the bathroom sink, they uncovered the massive hoard of VHS tapes. The footage on those tapes was far more monstrous than anyone could have predicted. While some tapes showed children performing ordinary house cleaning tasks, other tapes captured horrific acts of abuse. The most chilling part of the entire investigation was that several of the children identified in those videos were listed as active missing persons. James was arrested and faced a mountain of severe charges, including child pornography and kidnapping. The teenager realized with absolute certainty that if he had not jumped out of that car at the red light, he likely would have become another missing child statistic. And so, life went on, but the lurking dangers of online classifieds remained ever present. Fast forward to about 3 months ago, when a young college student and his roommate decided they wanted to buy a used couch for their apartment. They had a very tight budget, so they figured Craigslist would be the perfect place to search for cheap, secondhand furniture. The young man spent some time scrolling through the listings, and after clicking through about 3 pages of advertisements, he found a listing for a beautiful black leather couch. According to the seller, the couch was in fantastic condition, and the price was listed at a remarkably low $200. The young man had a brief passing thought that this deal was simply too good to be true, but he decided to ignore his gut feeling. He emailed the seller, agreed on the price, and received an address to pick up the couch. The problem was, his roommate was currently working overtime at his job, meaning the young man would have to make the drive and pick up the heavy couch all by himself. The address was located quite a bit outside of the main town, in a highly isolated area completely surrounded by dense, towering trees. In fact, the house was so deeply hidden in the woods that you had to drive all the way up a long, private dirt driveway just to see the structure. The young man parked his car, stepped out into the quiet woods, and walked up to the front door. The house was a small, weathered wooden cabin that looked incredibly eerie in the dim afternoon light. He knocked on the door once, but received no answer. He knocked a second time, and then a third time. This time he heard the distinct, heavy creaking of wooden floorboards coming from directly inside the house. Anyone could tell that these were footsteps, but the sounds were highly unusual. It sounded as though someone inside was deliberately tiptoeing toward the door, trying to move as silently as possible. Suddenly, a faint, muffled voice spoke through the thick wood of the closed door, asking if he was the couch guy. The voice sounded incredibly rushed, tense, and anxious. The young man replied that yes, he was there for the couch. The voice from behind the door quickly instructed him to walk around to the backyard, claiming that the leather couch was already set up back there. The young man felt a sudden, sharp wave of unease wash over him, but he brushed the feeling aside, telling himself that he was just being overly paranoid. He walked around the side of the wooden cabin and stepped into the backyard. What he saw there was an image that would be permanently burned into his memory. Standing in the middle of the overgrown yard were 4 exceptionally tall men. They were all dressed in identical, flowing black robes, and they stood in a tight circle with their hands pressed together in front of them. Directly in front of the robed men was a large, deep pit dug into the ground. The pit was covered by a heavy wooden hatch, secured tightly with a thick, rusted metal chain and a padlock. Before the young man could even begin to process the bizarre and terrifying sight, the rushed voice of the man from inside the house spoke behind him, asking where his friend was. In that single horrifying second, the young man realized what was happening. The occupants of the house had expected him to bring someone else to help move the heavy couch, and they had prepared a trap to capture both of them. He did not say a word. He immediately spun around on his heel, ran back to his car as fast as his legs could carry him, and frantically shoved the key into the ignition. He started the engine, and as he glanced up at his rearview mirror, he saw the front door of the cabin fly wide open. He slammed the car into first gear, stepped on the gas, and fled down the dirt driveway, leaving the terrifying scene behind. But the one detail that continues to make his blood run cold to this day is that throughout all of his email communications with the seller, he had never once mentioned to him that he had a roommate. But the absolute terror of these online encounters is not limited to adults or teenagers. At this point, let us look at another terrifying incident involving a young girl who was only 12 years old at the time. She had received a large amount of craft supplies for Christmas and was looking for a cheap storage bin to keep everything organized. Since the plastic storage totes at the local retail stores were far too expensive, she and her 27-year-old older sister decided to look for a second-hand option on Craigslist. They quickly found a listing from a seller offering a massive plastic storage tote for only $10. This was an unbelievable deal, as a brand new tote of that size would easily cost around $100. The seller lived relatively close to their neighborhood, so they sent an email to inquire about the item. The seller responded within an hour, asking where they should meet up to complete the trade. The 12-year-old girl suggested meeting at the local Dollar Tree parking lot, which was a very short, safe walk from their apartment building. But to her surprise, the seller immediately rejected the idea and asked if he could just bring the tote directly to her home. Since they lived in a secure apartment complex, having a complete stranger come directly to their door was highly inconvenient and felt unsafe, so the girl lied and claimed they lived much farther away. The seller quickly offered to drive the distance to meet them, but they firmly declined. Eventually, the seller agreed to meet at the Dollar Tree parking lot, but he insisted that he could only make it at 9 o'clock that evening. Even though it would be pitch black outside by then, the girl agreed to the time. It turns out, her older sister had to work a night shift at the local hospital that evening, so she told the young girl that she could walk to the Dollar Tree and back on her own, instructing her to bring her wooden pull-along wagon so she could easily haul the heavy plastic tote back. Her sister handed her a $10 bill, and at 8:30 in the evening the young girl began her walk. She arrived at the Dollar Tree parking lot right on time. Standing in the dark lot, she spotted a beat-up, rusted 2006 Kia parked near the edge of the property. Assuming this was the seller, she walked over and called out, asking if he had the tote. A man stepped out of the vehicle, but his hands were empty. He claimed that he had accidentally left the plastic tote back at his house, and he asked the 12-year-old girl if she wanted to hop into his car and take a quick drive with him to go get it. The girl immediately felt an intense wave of discomfort. She firmly said no, explaining that her family would not allow her to get into a stranger's car. The man then offered to drive her all the way back to her home afterward, but she refused again. The man leaned in closer, lowering his voice, and told, "Up until the age of 12 in 2010, my parents always insisted I have a babysitter. Being an only child probably had a lot to do with it. This rule might have gone on longer, but something happened with the last babysitter I ever had. He was 18 years old and his name was James. It was only the second time he was watching me overnight." Looking back, he was a really awkward, creepy kid who did not say much and had no sense of personal space. One evening, my parents had left for the night, and it was already getting quite late. I was sitting on the living room rug, watching my favorite show on the television. Suddenly, I heard the stairs creak. James came down from the guest room upstairs, where he was supposed to be sleeping. Instead of saying anything, he walked straight into the living room and sat down on the couch right behind me. He did not say a word, and he did not make a single sound. When I eventually turned around to look at him, he was just sitting there, staring directly at me with a completely blank expression on his face. I laughed shyly, and he broke the silence by asking if I wanted to play a video game. I said yes. James went upstairs to my dad's room and grabbed his Xbox 360. It was weird that he even knew it was there. He set it up in the living room and put on Halo 2. I was not a gamer, and he easily killed me 10 times in a row. James then decided to show me how to play better. He grabbed both of my hands to mimic the controls, standing so close that he was leaning against me. It made me very uneasy, so I told him I wanted to stop. He looked upset, sat back on the couch, and played alone. I went upstairs to my room, turned on the television, and fell asleep. Later, I woke up to the bright light of the television in my dark room. As I sat up, my mattress made a loud noise, but underneath it I heard a shuffling sound. I was scared but did not want to make noise. My eyes stopped on my closet door, which was halfway open. When a white screen flashed on the television, it revealed James standing inside my closet. I gasped, and he slowly stepped out, whispering for me to be quiet and telling me I was pretty. I saw an opening, slipped past him, and ran down to the office. I locked the door and grabbed the phone to call my dad. James knocked on the door, begging me not to call. My dad was furious on the phone and told me to stay there, saying he would be home in an hour. By then, James had left. My parents called the police, and James was arrested and ultimately charged with serious counts of sexual misconduct with a minor. After that day, my parents decided that I was finally old enough to be trusted at home by myself, and I never had a babysitter again. But even though it has been many years since that night, I still find myself thinking about James and what his true intentions were at least once every single day. A few years later, when I was a teenager, I started doing some babysitting myself. One weekend, I said goodbye to my mom and walked up the front steps of a house to watch a young boy named Tyler. When I arrived, Tyler's mother was in a massive hurry. She had already explained all the instructions to me over the phone so she could leave immediately. She jumped into a waiting cab and headed straight to the airport. Tyler was only 5 years old, and he had autism. I knew that watching him for the entire weekend was going to be a bit of a challenge. At first, I had to get used to his unique behaviors and how he liked to interact, but I quickly adapted. One thing I noticed early on was that Tyler talked to himself a lot. I would hear his voice coming from different rooms, and usually I assumed he was just playing, but sometimes it sounded like he was having a literal conversation. On our first night, I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of Tyler laughing out loud right outside my bedroom door. I was incredibly confused because I distinctly remembered pulling my bedroom door completely shut before getting into bed, but now it was standing wide open, letting the cold air from the hallway drift into my room. I got out of bed and realized the laughter was coming from Tyler's bedroom. As I walked toward his room, a loose floorboard creaked loudly under my foot. The moment that sound echoed, Tyler's laughter instantly stopped. The light inside his room suddenly clicked off, and I heard him rush to jump into his bed. I called out to Tyler, telling him he needed to stay in bed and go to sleep. I went back to my room and fell back asleep. The next morning I asked Tyler what he had been doing up so late, but he just said he did not remember. For the rest of the day, I tried to keep him entertained with games and television, but Tyler seemed much more interested in playing in his bedroom by himself. I let him do his own thing and spent the afternoon watching television and doing some light chores. When nighttime arrived, I tucked Tyler into his bed and told him to stay there. I went to the guest bedroom and fell asleep. About an hour later, I was woken up again by a faint giggling sound, followed by whispering. I sat up, rubbed my eyes, and called out his name, but there was no response. Then the giggling started again, coming from across my bedroom. I clicked on the lamp and gasped. Tyler was sitting inside my bedroom closet, with the door slid halfway open, revealing only his face staring out at me. It was an incredibly disturbing thing to see at 2 o'clock in the morning. I got out of bed, walked over, and pulled him out of the closet. I was upset with him and let him know it as I carried him back to his room. When I asked him why he did that, Tyler said that Tony told him to do it. I asked him who Tony was, and Tyler replied that Tony was the man who lived inside the closet. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself it was just his imagination. I told Tyler to stay in bed and went back to my room, but I could not shake the feeling of dread. I lay on my side, trying my best to clear my thoughts and fall asleep. Suddenly, there was a loud thud against my closet door. It sounded like a physical body part, like a knee or an elbow knocking against the wood. I froze. I called out Tyler's name, hoping he had snuck back into my room, but there was no answer. I called out his name again, much louder this time. From far down the hallway in his own bedroom, Tyler's tiny voice called back, asking me what I wanted. In that exact second, adrenaline spiked through my body. I leaped out of bed, sprinted down the hallway to Tyler's room, grabbed him, and carried him into the bathroom. I locked the bathroom door and called the police. I stayed on the line with the operator, whispering as quietly as I could. Eventually, I heard a loud pounding on the front door. The police had finally arrived at the scene. Strangely, I heard them open the front door without needing to break it down, which meant it was already unlocked. I ran out of the bathroom with Tyler and met them in the living room. It turned out that the intruder, the man who had been hiding inside the closet and talking to Tyler, had slipped out of the house, through the front door right before the police entered. That weekend was the last time I ever worked for that family, and I hoped that whoever was in that closet never returned. I was about 10 years old when my little brother T and I needed to be watched on a Saturday night. Our dad was scheduled to work a long night shift, and our mother was away on a trip to Italy. The man who agreed to watch us was named Keith. Keith actually worked with our dad. When my dad had mentioned at work that he was struggling to find someone to watch us, Keith immediately volunteered. Our dad did not know Keith incredibly well, other than occasionally exchanging quick greetings at the office, but he knew him well enough to trust him with his children. It was 6 o'clock in the evening, and it was already pitch black outside when our dad drove us over to Keith's house. We walked up to the front porch, and our dad rang the doorbell. Right from the very start, Keith seemed incredibly friendly. In fact, he was almost overly friendly, wearing a massive, constant smile no matter what he was saying. He and my dad stood by the door talking for a while before introducing us. Keith seemed like a genuinely nice guy because he kept trying to strike up a friendly conversation with my brother T and me. After our dad said goodbye and drove off, Keith gave us a quick tour of his house. My brother and I went into the living room and sat down on the couch. I was incredibly excited when I noticed a Nintendo GameCube sitting by the television. Keith stood right there in the doorway with his hands resting on his hips, watching me with that same big permanent smile plastered across his face as he observed me getting all excited while hooking up the console. While I started playing a Sonic the Hedgehog game, Keith turned to my 6-year-old brother T and told him to come upstairs with him. He said he had some cool games and toys for him to play with up there. The two of them went upstairs, and I stayed downstairs playing my game. A significant amount of time passed, and I eventually started to get bored of playing the game by myself. I left the GameCube running and decided to head upstairs to see what my brother and Keith were doing. The upstairs of Keith's house had a long hallway with one closed door at the end. I figured they must be in there, so I walked over and opened it. To my surprise, the room was completely dark, illuminated only by the glow of a computer screen sitting on a desk. I walked over to the desk to see what was on the monitor. On the screen, there was a camera feed showing 2 different video angles. One camera angle showed an empty bedroom with a lamp turned on. The second camera angle showed a room where my little brother T and Keith were sitting on the beast